Good morning to our friends in the United States and good afternoon to our friends in Europe. It's really a delight to see so many people participating in this third annual Transatlantic Business Summit. I'm Myron Brilliant. I'm the Executive Vice President and Head of International Relations at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And we're really delighted to have you all joining us for what I said is the Chamber's third annual Transatlantic Business Work Summit. Let me begin by thanking our sponsors, Amazon, Bayer, Citi, Google, Microsoft, and UPS. Their support has made this two-day event possible, and we really appreciate the partnership to expand transatlantic relations. I also want to give a special shout out as well to the Chamber's European Affairs team that put this event together, starting with Marjorie Chorlins, the Senior Vice President for the European Program, Garrett Workman, and Kara O'D, who have labored very hard to get today's proceedings moving forward. So let us begin on a high note, which is to say that colleagues across the Chamber and across the transatlantic space have made today's event possible. And as I said at the outset, we're really delighted that hundreds of guests will virtually participate on both sides of the Atlantic for this summit. The theme of this year's summit is really leading together a partnership in a changing world. The world is changing fast, often at such a pace that it's hard to keep up, certainly for governments. New ways of doing businesses are emerging, and some of that is very exciting. New alliances are forming, new people are entering and exiting the workforce every day, and the planet is also changing. And digitalization is really fueling much of this change. Despite the lightning fast changes we see every day, some things, however, remain constant. Our commitment to the rule of law, our fundamental grounding in democratic values, and our firm conviction that every person deserves a right to be treated with dignity and respect. Another constant is our belief that America is stronger when we work shoulder to shoulder with our allies to seize opportunities and to overcome challenges. A vibrant and prosperous transatlantic relationship is foundational to our success, both commercially and geostrategically. The Chamber has long been a staunch champion of broadening and deepening our trade and investment ties. Companies on both sides of the Atlantic demonstrate this commitment every day. This purpose is to expand trade and create jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. As a result of the commitment of our companies, the US and the EU enjoy the largest, most powerful commercial relationship in the world. We have our differences, and we should not ignore them. Good friends can disagree, but there's more that unites us than divides us. And so after years of some drift and friction in our relationship, we are really heartened by the renewed commitment to partnership on both sides of the Atlantic demonstrated by government officials at the highest level. We've seen, for example, movement in recent months to address some high-profile trade irritants, including the large civil aircraft dispute and most recently, the Section 232 tariffs on imports of European steel and aluminum. We applaud the launch earlier this year of the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which aims really to promote coordinated approaches to emerging and advanced technologies, fostering partnerships, we hope, for innovation, and where possible, forging coordinated responses from governments to challenges from non-market economies. There's a lot of work to be done on this agenda. First and foremost, we need alignment and agreement to provide legal certainty for continued transatlantic data flows. We also need to see the Trade and Technology Council, the TDC, engage with stakeholders, business stakeholders, to deliver concrete and meaningful results in a timely manner. And we must take care to ensure that new policies and regulations being formulated on both sides of the Atlantic are non-discriminatory and are consistent with our obligations to the World Trade Organization. The jury is definitely decidedly out on this one, and we are committed to working with both governments in Europe and governments in Washington to make something happen on this front. Over the next 2 days, American and European business executives and leading government officials will share their views on some of the greatest opportunities and yet also address some of the challenges the United States and Europe together face in a rapidly changing world. You'll hear them talk about opportunities for collaboration, and we're going to foster and support those opportunities. But you're also going to hear us talk about some of the ways that we can continue to foster change in the transatlantic relationship. Collaboration is very impactful in a lot of areas, but let's keep the digital economy connected. Let's leverage lessons learned from the pandemic. Let's promote innovation to address the climate transition. And let's respond to unfair practices from non-market economies at home and abroad. We'll hear from government officials. Secretary of Commerce Raimondo will speak. Ambassador Tai, I'll do an interview with her on Thursday. Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs Fernandez will speak. And of course, the EU Executive Vice President Vestager, among others. Audience members, we're going to encourage you to ask questions by typing into the box at the right of your screen. And we encourage you throughout to tweet about the event using the hashtag TBW21. TBW21. Now it's my privilege to introduce a very special friend of the U.S. Chamber, a friend of mine, and a person who has done a great job in supporting the work of trade and investment and leading many efforts on the digital front. My good friend, Fred Humphreys, Corporate Vice President of U.S. Government Affairs at Microsoft. He's got a day job, largely focused on the domestic agenda these days, but he also has an important job that we've asked him to undertake on behalf of the U.S. Chamber. He chairs the U.S. Chamber's International Policy Committee, which is the board-level body that sets chamber trade policy and investment issues. And he is well known as a champion of trade and also as a champion of responsible technology policy. Less well known is his storied career as a champion basketball player, including setting numerous records for his high school in Nashville, Tennessee. Fred, I could talk a lot about your trade work and your leadership in Washington, but someday we're going to talk about your basketball skills. Fred, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Myron, and thank you for the shout out when it comes to basketball and for the introduction and all the work you and your team do at the Chamber. We appreciate your work organizing today's summit. As chair of the International Policy Committee, it has been a pleasure to partner on this programming and other efforts at the Chamber. This summit is happening at a critical time for the transatlantic economic and business relationship. A strong and collaborative transatlantic relationship is critical to addressing today's challenges. We at Microsoft have been working hard with our partners in Europe on a variety of global technology issues, including the need for the EU and US to be a part of a common technology ecosystem. We are excited about one of the newest transatlantic collaborative efforts, the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. The business community looks forward to seeing how the Council works closely with stakeholders to ensure that a variety of voices are heard. Today, I have the honor of introducing Secretary Gina Raimondo. Secretary Raimondo is one of the leaders behind the Trade and Technology Council and a critical voice on this relationship. At Microsoft, we have the opportunity to work closely with the Secretary in her home state of Rhode Island over the years on expanding computer science education, and we appreciate her dedicated work. Thank you, Secretary, for joining us today and for your leadership on policies that strengthen the transatlantic partnership. Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the U.S. Chamber for organizing today's Transatlantic Business Work Summit. And I appreciate being able to share the progress the Biden-Harris administration has made on technology and trade with our EU partners. As an administration, and at the Department of Commerce, we are committed to restoring and deepening the transatlantic alliance. We view this as a top foreign policy priority, and we're working closely with the EU and member states to make it happen. Together, we launched the Trade and Technology Council. This is an opportunity for us to update the rules of the road for the 21st century economy, while expanding our competitiveness around the world. Commerce and our co-chairs at USTR and the State Department have been working closely with the European Commission on the TTC. 2 months ago, we had our inaugural meeting in Pittsburgh. Both the U.S. government and the European Commission have since then been soliciting views from stakeholders, including from many of the Chamber members listening today. Last month, Commerce facilitated an event for over 200 U.S. stakeholders, delivering on our promise of robust engagement. And we so greatly value public perspectives on the goals and activities of the TTC and the key issues that we should address. The 5 commerce-led working groups have been coordinating closely with our European colleagues. Among other activities, the working groups aim to coordinate on international standards in critical technologies like artificial intelligence, cooperate on strategies to promote supply chain resilience and diversification, and launch outreach activities to hear from small and medium-sized enterprises to better understand the barriers to their digital empowerment. Ultimately, it's about creating an environment where businesses can flourish. My team and I have also had numerous conversations with our EU colleagues, including Executive Vice President Vestager, on key tech issues. These include the European Union's Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Acts. The EU wants to use these pieces of legislation to create a fair, transparent, and safe digital space. But we have serious concerns that these proposals will disproportionately impact U.S.-based tech firms and their ability to adequately serve EU customers and uphold security and privacy standards. We understand the proposals are moving quickly through the EU's legislative process, but now more than ever, we encourage officials to continue listening to our concerns by stakeholders before finalizing their decision. I would like to emphasize that the Biden administration considers finalizing an enhanced privacy shield a top priority, and I personally remain very actively engaged in the negotiations. Although we have not yet reached a deal on the privacy shield, we're optimistic for a durable, legally defensible arrangement in the near future. As we navigate this rapidly changing digital world, we need each other now more than ever. We're allies with a core commitment to competitive, open economies. We can continue to work together as partners toward finding more common ground. Thank you.
President for European Affairs here at the U.S. Chamber. We thank the Secretary and the administration for their leadership and engagement, laying the groundwork for a stronger transatlantic relationship and a robust economic recovery. All of us at the Chamber look forward to continuing our active partnership with the Commerce Department and others in the administration on the new U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council, and to secure a new agreement providing legal certainty for data flows and on many other shared priorities. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Jose Fernandez, the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. Jose, over to you.
Thank you to the U.S. Chamber for the invitation to speak with you all virtually at this year's summit. The transatlantic economy is one of our most powerful economic engines in the world. Our economies and people are among the most interconnected, and our shared values underpin this relationship. The Biden administration recognizes the importance of this relationship and working with partners and allies in Europe, which is why we've worked so hard to raise our level of ambition in our relationship with the EU and our European allies and partners. We're stronger when we work together, first resolving our bilateral disputes and then working together to chart a path toward global solutions. This is the approach we took with Boeing Airbus and more recently on trade in steel and aluminum. We're excited to work with the EU to transform how these essential materials will be traded by addressing carbon intensity and global overcapacity in steel and aluminum. I'm sure many of us are concerned about the news about the COVID-19 Omicron variant. And here too, we're working closely together with Europe to tackle this new challenge, including through our joint agenda to beat the global pandemic, vaccinate the world, and build back better our health security infrastructure to ensure that we're better prepared for future pandemics. And with that context, I'd like to focus my remarks today on three areas. First, the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. Second, the commercial engagement in Europe. And third, climate cooperation. Turning first to the TTC, it was a privilege to participate in the launch of the TTC in September. Several of the five co-chairs are also participating in the summit. Secretaries Blinken and Raimondo, U.S. Trade Representative Tai, and EU Commissioners Dombrovskis and Vestager met in Pittsburgh, a city whose residents have overcome economic challenges and which moved from being predominantly a steel town to a technology and innovation hub. We launched the TTC and we tried to advance an affirmative values-based US-EU technology vision and to address shared global challenges. Technology is at the center of global competition and it's a driver of good job growth. We're working with European allies and partners to ensure that together we remain the world's leaders in innovation and standards development, grounded always in democratic values and delivering real benefits for our citizens. We use fora like the TTC to develop strong relationships at all levels so that our democracies can collaborate and strike the right regulatory balance on issues like privacy, content moderation, data sharing, and digital trade. Let me give you a few examples of this collaboration in action. First, we're working together to build resilient, diverse, and secure supply chains. This includes a domestic focus, for example, on semiconductor manufacturing, but it also includes working with European partners to ensure that our efforts are mutually reinforcing. Second, because of the risks posed by untrusted vendors in advanced communications technologies, we're working to protect technologies like 5G by promoting the use of trusted and diverse vendors and advocating for high security standards. Third, we're also looking at how to coordinate approaches on those sensitive technologies that require export controls and investment screening so that we can make sure that strategic competitors are not exploiting our innovative ecosystems to gain military or national security advantage. Before I move on to my next topic, let me emphasize that strengthening the transatlantic relationship and delivering on an ambitious tech agenda also depends on you. We need feedback from a broad range of stakeholders, from businesses, from labor, from civil society, to help us deliver concrete outcomes that improve lives and uphold our shared values. Both the United States and the EU have channels to engage with stakeholders, including dedicated websites where you can share your views directly with us, and I look forward to hearing from you. Moving on to my second topic, commercial engagement. As I mentioned earlier, the US-EU economic relationship is among the largest, most integrated, and interdependent relationships in the world. Together, the United States and the EU account for a quarter of global trade and almost half of global GDP, representing a huge driver of economic prosperity for citizens on both sides. For example, this relationship has created 16 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. In my role at the State Department, I ensure that our missions in Europe and offices here in Washington work across the U.S. government agencies and with both European governments and all of you who are engaged in the transatlantic economy in order to address challenges and leverage opportunities in key sectors like emerging technologies, high-quality infrastructure, and clean tech. Finally, turning to climate. President Biden has placed the climate crisis at the forefront of U.S. foreign policy and national security planning. Both the United States and the EU submitted ambitious Paris Agreement emissions reduction targets for 2030. However, unless we bring the rest of the world with us, we will not be able to effectively mitigate the climate crisis. And this is exactly what we're doing. The EU and the United States are working together to encourage the rest of the world, and particularly major economies, to raise their level of ambition on climate action, on everything from increasing emission reduction targets to phasing out fossil fuel financing, to making more ambitious commitments to close the gap on climate finance. For example, at COP26, the US and the European Union formally launched the Methane Pledge, which more than 100 countries have already joined. They represent 70% of the global economy and nearly half of the global methane emissions. This complements the U.S. Methane Emissions Reduction Action Plan, bold steps announced by President Biden to redouble efforts from across the government to dramatically reduce U.S. methane emissions, cut consumer costs, protect workers and communities, maintain and create thousands of high-quality union jobs, and promote U.S. innovation and manufacturing of critical new technologies. So, if there's one thing that I'd like you to take away today, it's this. The U.S. and the EU, both of us, are stronger together. We're well positioned to tackle our greatest challenges, including climate change. And together, we will also be better placed to seize commercial opportunities to create jobs and benefits for our people when we are working together. Now more than ever, our mutual success depends on our cooperation. I thank you for your time today and for sharing your interest and expertise as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those remarks, Undersecretary. It's now my pleasure to introduce a truly stellar panel of speakers to talk about the importance of the transatlantic digital economy. I'm Ryan Heath, author of Politico's Global Insider newsletter, now also a weekly podcast. And joining me are Rita Ballo, who's Chief of Staff and Europe Lead on International Government Affairs at Google, Brian Hendricks, Vice President of Public Policy and Public Affairs at Nokia Americas, previously in the Senate Committee staff, Chris Padilla, who's Vice President for Government and Regulatory Affairs at IBM, with a long history of service at USTR and the Commerce Department, and CJ Mahoney, who's Deputy General Counsel at Microsoft, who joined from USTR, where he was Deputy Representative. Welcome to each of you.
Thank you.
Let's dive straight into it. I thought I'd start with a general question that each of you can answer. And I wanted you to give us your temperature check on how you rate the risk of tech decoupling between the US and the EU. And maybe give us a flavor of where you see the areas where you're most positive about cooperation and capitalizing on common ground. Maybe I'll turn to you first, CJ.
I would rate the risk as high. I think actually that's the direction in which we are presently headed. The good thing, though, is I think the policymakers are cognizant of that, and we have an opportunity to turn before the car runs off the road. But I think that's going to take a lot more than just dialogue and further meetings and non-binding joint statements. It's going to take, I think, both sides really leaning into this, and just two things that I would say are needed. Number one, I think it's really important that the EU realize that there's urgency in this situation for it as well as for the United States. I understand, and I think the United States really needs to embrace the motivations that have led a number of people in the EU to embrace the concepts of tech sovereignty, because what that means is that the EU wants to have a thriving tech sector, and I think that's a reasonable desire, and it's something that the United States ought to foster and make the argument for why it's better off, why the European tech sector is better off if it's part of a common technology ecosystem that includes the United States than if the walls of that ecosystem are confined to continental Europe. I also think, though, that the U.S. over the long run has got to get serious about comprehensive privacy legislation and reforms to the FISA process. because no matter what fix we can have to the to the privacy shield, and I know that policymakers are working hard on that now, I think it's ultimately going to take legislative action by the U.S. Congress in order to build a strong foundation for this relationship going forward.
Thanks, CJ. You hit a lot of notes. We will unpack more in the rest of the discussion. Rita, maybe I'll turn to you now. You're European by birth, working for an American company in an international role. How do you see these risks?
Thank you so much, Ryan, and for the Chamber for convening this forum and for inviting me to be here with you today. I mean, Google is a proud American company, but we also feel home in Europe. We have over 30,000 employees across the EU, very significant investment, very significant partnership. So a strong transatlantic relation is really essential from our perspective. And as we heard Secretary Raimondo said, like the Transatlantic Alliance is one of the Biden-Harris administration's foreign policy priorities, which is great. And we did see an intensification of the dialogue over the past few months. And one of this was resulting in the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. And this is something that we as a company have supported from the get-go. And it's great to see the TTC come to life. And also it was fantastic to participate in the launch event through Karan Bhatia, who's the head of our government affairs team. And I take CJ's point of dialogue is probably not enough, but it's very, very important to achieve the objectives that the Undersecretary just talked about fighting the climate change or overcoming the pandemic and restoring economic growth to both the US and Europe. So the few areas that I would highlight, seconding a bit what CJ said, like legal certainty around international data flows is super important, and it's great to hear that it's a top priority on this side of the Atlantic, as well as I assume in Europe as well. Consultation and coordination on regulatory principles. The Undersecretary mentioned, or Secretary Raimondo mentioned DMA and DSA. But we also should think about, what more can we do to make sure that trade and technology benefits everyone. One of the panels in Pittsburgh was about skills for workers, digital skills that they do need to be able to participate and succeed in the increasingly digitalized economy. And I think there's much more tangible things that we can do, for example, there as well.
Chris, I'll bring you in now. I've noticed IBM put a real focus on cooperation and engagement. Is it working out, or are the tech decoupling risks as big as ever in the relationship?
I think the risks are high, although I think the imperative for cooperation is stronger than ever. There's an interesting op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this morning talking about Chinese advancement in advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and 5G and quantum computing. It's our strong view that US-EU cooperation is essential. That cooperation alone won't be able to overcome the strategic challenge that, in strategic terms now is a technological competition as much as a political or military competition. But without US-EU cooperation, we know we will each fall behind. And so the imperative to work together in areas like artificial intelligence, 5G, quantum computing, advanced robotics is more important than ever. And that's why we called for and welcomed the creation of the TTC. Having said that, there are forces on both sides of the Atlantic that want to throw rocks at this relationship. There are real concerns about technological sovereignty. On the EU side, the notion that US headquartered companies should not be able to participate in a European cloud, for example. And on the US side, there's a lot of hyperventilating about EU initiatives, regulatory initiatives, claiming that they're anti-American. Things like the Digital Markets Act or the artificial intelligence regulations. And we don't see it that way at all. In fact, just as Europe was a first mover on privacy with the GDPR, Europe will likely be a first mover on the regulation of AI and also in antitrust and other areas. But that's largely because the US Congress hasn't been able to get its act together to figure out how to regulate it in these areas. So we need to keep the imperative of cooperation at the front of mind and sort of zoom out and look at the big strategic picture in the world about why that cooperation is essential, and not let those who want to throw stones figure out.
Brian, to bring you into the discussion, Nokia has been at the pointy end of some of these debates about how to cooperate or how to exclude, for example, Huawei from different networks that you've got a real keen interest in. Tell us what it's like on the inside of that debate, and how that makes you feel about transatlantic digital cooperation.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thanks to the Chamber for including us. We're fairly new members, so we're welcomed in and jumping right into the discussions. We're a European company, but the U.S. is our largest market as an equipment supplier. So you can imagine that we are in constant contact with governments on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of setting policy. I guess just to make a real quick comment on a couple of points that the other panelists made, I'm in hearty agreement with many of them. I think CJ's points about the privacy shield are important ones, because what underlies the collapse of the privacy shield was distrust. When I was in the Senate, worked on FISA reform. It's a black box. So we have to get back to a more transparent relationship on how we're going to treat data and protect and respect the treatment of customer information. In terms of, do I think that the risk is high of decoupling? Maybe not quite as high as CJ, but this has been on a slow burn for a very long time. It dates back a long time, and at its core, a lot of it is a failure to listen and a failure to engage in what I would call interest-based bargaining by defining the common sets of interests that we have. And that was exacerbated in the last administration with some fairly caustic rhetoric. And there were good signs early. I think, President Biden talked about the EU as the cornerstone of our engagement with the rest of the world. Yet, I think partially in our sector, what the feedback from the European side has been is that the U.S. has had a very narrow technology policy, almost a one-string banjo focused on vendor diversity, which we fully support. But you have to recognize from the European side, it has strong vendors in the ecosystem. And that's not a single point of tech policy engagement. There must be more. And the good news is there's quite a bit. That can be done in coordinated 6G and advanced research, as Chris was talking about, AI. You have the USICA bill here in the U.S. that the Senate passed that identified 12 core areas where the U.S. wants to focus R&D. Well, there's a desire in the European Union to have a resilient, redundant supply chain as well. And so those are areas for commonality in research. There's opportunities to confront unfair trade practices through both the coordinated R&D, the use of coordinated structured financing to combat some of the things that have been done by the development banks in China. But the other thing too is both sides have to recognize that localization pushes don't help anybody in this discussion. That's how the vendor diversity issue is striking the European side right now, is that this looks like a transparent industrial-based stimulation project for the United States. And obviously on the U.S. side, there's concerns about excluding web scalers from participating in the digital market. So they have to take a step back from those things and focus on common areas like screening sensitive foreign investments, combating cybercrime, some of the coordinated R&D that I talked about. And then I think if people find a common set of interests that they can bargain around, then there's a chance to kind of lower the temperature. But if that doesn't happen, if we continue to see the push towards the U.S. saying only jumping fully on board with our containment strategy vis-a-vis China will do, only vendor diversity will do, and the EU pushing things on its side, then they're going to keep talking past each other. And then the risk of decoupling, I think, accelerates.
Well, speaking of talking past each other and thinking of the examples that some of you just mentioned around privacy shield, development of 6G, and so on, it took my mind directly to the new Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. It's obviously starting to get its ball rolling. And I personally do not doubt the good faith behind the effort. But as a journalist, I certainly wonder what the tangible deliverables could be in 2022. It's got to get off to a decent, strong start for people to continue believing in it and for it to make some big gains. So I'd like to ask each of you what you think those top deliverables should be in 2022. Maybe we'll start with you on this one, Rita.
Yeah, thank you. I think what you're asking is exactly right. Like, how do we find not necessarily like a really broad overarching agreement here, but what are the very concrete steps that we can take? So maybe I pick up on my very last point from the introduction on skilling. And we were talking about, for example, career certifications that many in industry provide. We are being one of them. And these are really a way to provide the digital skills that people need to get jobs immediately, after completing the training that only takes like 3 to 6 months. But there's a way to upscale that. We have about 150 partners in that endeavor from our end. But, can we look at this from a transatlantic perspective? Can we look at what are the obstacles for such certification to really kind of pick up and reach a broader segment of the population? That can be one area where we can zoom in on.
Great. Chris, how about you?
Suggest that the first priority should be to prioritize research and innovation in emerging technologies. I think the EU and the US could work together on principles for the ethical advancement of AI, but also work together on how they could jointly do innovation and research in semiconductors and quantum computing. Both of those are areas where there's tremendous amount of potential for university collaboration, industrial collaboration. And then I think it also would be useful to coordinate investment policies. Both the investments that the U.S. and the EU are making in advanced technologies, and also investment reviews of external actors who may be seeking to invest in our respective markets. Those would be some concrete areas I'd look at first.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the investment industrial policy side of things, Brian, I wonder, in principle, we don't want to see protectionism. I think that's a fairly widely held view in this sector, and amongst a lot of officials as well. But it does really feel like industrial policy is the new reality, given the new strategic competition between democracies and authoritarian states. How could we sort of integrate that political reality with what would be more economically orthodox in some kind of framework like the Trade and Technology Council? And, there's obviously applications to your 5G and 6G work there.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is the forced localization is a real problem we're confronting in our sector. And believe it or not, it isn't just authoritarian countries that are looking this way. Obviously, everybody is looking to stimulate their own industrial base. We're seeing renewed views in India and Turkey and other places that local compelled localization is something that is a reasonable approach. Obviously, when you have a scale business the way we do, those kinds of things are a big challenge. And I think from the EU and the US side, the first thing to do would be to recognize we don't want to exacerbate that further. We've had a huge push for Buy American, which is not a new issue, but ultimately has a new level of dogged determination and is part of almost every current legislative debate, including the infrastructure plan that was just passed, where they're very soon going to discover that they didn't waive its application, and they're going to find it very difficult to find the equipment that they need to close the digital divide. So the first thing would be, let's not exacerbate that further. Let's take a step back from the localism requirements or excluding people from participating in R&D programs. And then let's focus on these common areas. I co-sign what Chris said. I mean, I think a common platform for looking at the ethical advancement of artificial intelligence, that's going to be a huge part of the future of mobile and fixed networks as we integrate AI and machine learning deeper and deeper into the network design. So having a common framework for that is important. The foundational 6G research agenda, which nobody is really talking about except at a handful of CTO levels. It's not a priority in the US dialogue at the moment, which is focused, as again I said, on vendor diversity. The Chinese are working very hard and pouring a lot of money into foundational 6G research. So to the extent that people are worried about a continuation of this 5G divide between the West and the Chinese suppliers, you need to invest heavily in foundational 6G research. And we're not doing that nearly enough. There should be a shared interest in that. And again, I think the idea that you don't have to identify a country as a foreign adversary to recognize that right now, whether it's semiconductors or many other areas, we have a supply chain for technology and components that is heavily dependent on one region of the world. There should be a common interest in developing a more robust and resilient supply chain. So that means coordinated investment. We have the CHIPS Act in the US, you've got a CHIPS Act in Europe. Making sure that those are working together as opposed to competition with one another, and then using that as a model for how to look at coordinated research and investment in other sectors. The goal doesn't have to be let's de-risk a particular country. It's about let's have a more redundant, resilient supply chain. I think everybody can get next to that without necessarily having to envision the Europeans entering into some very difficult bilateral trade discussions with the Chinese if they embrace some of the more direct approaches that the U.S. has pursued. So I think there's a lot of common areas that we can look at, but we haven't been doing that at this point.
CJ, sorry to leave you out on the limb for a while. Do you think there can be some positive, proactive deliverable in 2022, or is it more in the zone of not exacerbating the existing problems?
Well, I guess I'm trying to think of a clever analogy. I mean, I think the TCC is great. Microsoft is fully supportive of it. If we'd had something like this, 10 or 20 years ago, maybe we'd be in a better position than we are now. But I mean, I think it's almost like we're like standing in front of our house, thinking about how we're going to improve the landscaping, when we're seeing, flames come up from the roof in the form of the Privacy Shield negotiations. It's difficult for me to believe that we'll be able to have meaningful deliverables out of the TTC if the Privacy Shield negotiations are not successful. I just think that is, if we can't figure that out, it's hard for me to see how we're going to have, really substantive outcomes on any of these other issues. I can think about what those would be. And the coordinated research is interesting, but that's going to require, in order for that to be something other than just talking points, it's going to require, dollars and euros that will, where there will be commitments to spend them in certain ways that are mutually beneficial. It might require regulatory changes in both countries. I mean, I know that there's not I was disappointed at the beginning of the TTC where there was just a lot of kind of back channel discussion in the press about how this isn't going to be a binding trade agreement. So nobody think about TTIP or anything like that. I thought that sort of just threw a lot of cold water on the ambitions for the project. But I don't know. At the end of the day, I don't know whether it's a trade agreement or not. I just think that there has to be substance out of this, and frankly, what the substance is something that. I consider sort of negotiable, but again, I don't see any of this. I think the whole thing is unfortunately going to be stillborn if the Privacy Shield negotiations continue to be at a stalemate.
You make a really valid point. So I'm going to throw two kind of like lightning response questions back at everyone, and we can start with you, CJ, seeing as we're on the topic. Question one: do any of you care to guess at a date for when we might get a new Privacy Shield agreement? So that's question one. And I guess question two is, if we can't have a full TTIP, the full EU-US trade agreement, is it unrealistic to think we might be able to have some tech sectoral agreement in, let's say, the next 5 years? I'll throw it to you, CJ, and we'll.
All right. Well, I'll just give a quick question on the one. I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to give you 2 dates, because I think that the date will either be December 31st of this year, meaning that they will treat this aspirational deadline of the end of the year is real, and that will be a forcing mechanism for policymakers to tell the negotiators to put their pens down, or it's just a question mark. And unfortunately, I think at that point, the European political calendar with the French elections, it throws in a complication. At that point, it's not clear to me what the next forcing event is, other than unfortunately rulings by data protection authorities and courts in the EU. Which could turn what is, kind of a moment of uncomfortable uncertainty into something that more closely resembles a crisis.
Great. Chris, how about you? You dare to answer?
I would say I fear that the most likely action-forcing event will be some sort of a court decision that would affect some of the other data transfer mechanisms that are being used right now, like standard contractual clauses that allow data to continue to flow across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, the history of this issue has been that in most cases, it has taken some sort of a court decision in Europe to result in changes. To the extent that any new privacy shield agreement is going to involve change in U.S. law, which I hope it won't, because that's hard to do, that further complicates things. So I would not hazard a guess other than to say, we've continued this far. My guess is that there'll have to be something that forces it, and it may be a court case.
Brian, how about you?
I think that's probably right, although I think all three of the other panelists are probably far more engaged in the privacy shield discussion than we are. I think there's distrust that exists here. It's not just the lack of a comprehensive U.S. privacy regime, which I think continues, at least in the discussions I've had, to be something that the Europeans and others have a hard time understanding. And that doesn't provide a real strong foundation for getting to an agreement on a framework. But I guess I'd make one other comment, which is maybe I'm a little more optimistic than CJ, and that's not certainly what I'm known for, unbridled optimism. But I actually think there's an opportunity for what I call refrigerator moments, like when my 7-year-old is struggling with a topic or I want to motivate him, I'll put something on the refrigerator that we can celebrate around. I think there are some low-hanging issues that the EU and the US can agree on that would give some positive momentum here. I do think 6G research is an area where both are engaged. There are already flagships set up, like 6G flagship in Finland. There are dollars flowing. There are euros flowing. I think there's opportunities for coordination. I think on the supply chain resiliency and redundancy question, there's a lot of interest in having that, whether it's, as a check on China or otherwise. So I'm optimistic that they can find some of those areas. And if they focus small, there's something to build. The last thing that we haven't talked about at all here is what I hear from the European side is they're not entirely sure how much the U.S. is really in to this re-engagement as they watch what's happening in the Quad. That looks to be an area where the U.S. is putting a tremendous amount of energy in pushing its policy views. And that has to be seen, I think, by the Europeans as supplementary and not in lieu of a coordinated engagement with the EU. But I think that can be overcome. But I am a little more optimistic if we start small that we can create some momentum.
And Rita, over to you for any thoughts on those dates.
Well, what we keep hearing is what CJ referenced, is that probably by the end of the year, there may be an agreement. So we're hopeful that this is the case. I think the other thing that I would like to second what the others said, that we need to find a way that this agreement is durable. There's a chance that there's going to be a challenge against whatever agreement is reached again, and it will go up to the court in Europe again. And we do need an agreement that withstand that challenge. So having an agreement as soon as possible is very, very important, and hopeful that this is going to be the end of the year, but also needs something that is durable and survives the court challenge.
That's a point well taken. Let's move on to some of the next legislation on the docket. We know there are problems in the US with getting some of those big pieces out of the system. So it appears, at least to my non-expert eyes, that the EU's Digital Markets Act is kind of the next big thing people are already dealing with, but which might really land on people's plates in the coming months. I know that there are concerns among some American companies about what they see as lack of due process. We've got IP protection questions as well. I wanted to dig into that a little bit. Rita, maybe I'll stick with you. What would you like to see changed in the legislation? And if it lands roughly where it is now, can you live with it overall, even if you're not happy with some of the parts of it?
Yeah, sure. I think where I would like to start is like obviously with size comes scrutiny, and we're not resisting this. We follow the debate super closely, and also to see like, you know, what we can do better than what we do today. But you know, there are concerns that this legislation signals out only a handful of U.S. tech companies, and to the extent that that is the case, we are worried about that. And as you mentioned, like some of the areas that we're focusing on as a company is indeed those due process, privacy, security, and other safeguards to be included in the legislation, in particular when you talk about like far-reaching obligations that we're talking about here, and also robust regulatory dialogue as we start implementing some of these rules will be very important from our perspective. Some of these changes are already reflected in the Council text. The European Parliament is, of course, still deliberating of their final negotiating position here. Ultimately, what we want as a company is to be able to provide, you know, state-of-the-art, innovative services in Europe in a way that is, you know, non-discriminatory and provides a fair treatment for our services. And we hope that this is going to be the case once this legislation is adopted.
Yeah. A quick follow-up there. I saw there's a blog post out about worries about the personalization of algorithms. And so that gets to the heart of your point, which is if you can't personalize it, how can you deliver a good, innovative service? But then when they're personalized, how does anyone provide the check and balance if something goes wrong with that algorithm there? Is that something that just happened to pop up today, or that's one of your big concerns with the legislation?
I don't know whether what blog exactly you're thinking about, but you know,
it was an internal Google one, but I realize you haven't read it. So it's not
internal Google one. I think, you know, personalization is really a core part of a lot of our services that helps you, you know, when you go on maps and say like, I want to go home, I want to go to the office. Like, obviously then if you choose to do so, then the service will remember where home is, and it's like making your life easier. It helps, you know, with the search results. It helps with a bunch of the things that we provide. But, you know, we take it that there are room for improvement here, and then there's something more that we can do about, you know, explaining to the user what's really happening and give the user choice around it. So when you think about, for example, advertising, you know, the advertising that you see on search, there's a little window there that says, you know, why this ad? Why did you see this ad? And then takes you to places where you can, you know, make choices around it. So this is an area that we think really hard and you know, invest a lot in improvement. I don't know the details of the blog, but that's definitely something that we're paying a lot of attention to.
Thank you very much. CJ, Microsoft was once famous for having a very antagonistic relationship with the EU, and you've worked really hard to change that and to be in a different position. Where do you see the Digital Markets Act at the moment? What's your read on it?
Well, I think consistent with the change in our, you know, our corporate culture around these issues, you know, we've tried to understand it and, you know, tried to be positive, and really also try to, you know, consider carefully what were the motivations behind it. It's, I mean, the reality is there's been a lot of major changes in the economy as you know, these big tech companies, like some of those represented on the call, including us, are a part of. And but the, you know, the regulatory architecture, particularly in the competition area, hasn't kept pace with it. So you know, again, we sort of see it as an opportunity to get this right rather than as a threat.
Absolutely. Chris, are you roughly in that same zone there?
I would agree. I don't think the fact that the DMA targets a fairly narrow group of companies is in any way anti-American. The scope is narrow because it's the European competition architecture is being modernized to focus on the marketplace behavior of certain kinds of companies and what they're doing in the market. That's not anti-American any more than the fact that the FTC and the DOJ have launched antitrust cases against 4 U.S. companies is somehow improper. You know, maybe where there's smoke, there's fire. When antitrust authorities are looking into behavior and targeting it on certain kinds of behavior and certain companies, that suggests that, as CJ said, there's a need for a modernized architecture to look at digital competition issues. I think that's what the Digital Markets Act does. It's why IBM has generally welcomed it, and we continue to provide positive feedback to the Commission, Parliament, and Council on it.
Thanks. Brian, anything to chip in there? I think you are muted, Brian.
Sorry about that. I would agree with Chris. I don't think the intent is necessarily anti-American. I think, as with privacy, the area of antitrust, you have some cultural differences between Europe and the U.S. The U.S. antitrust system is fairly antiquated. That doesn't mean it's bad. It's very effects-based in its approach. It is calibrated to allow larger companies to emerge, so long as efficiencies and benefits overtake the costs or the concerns. Europe is more comfortable using antitrust as a shaping tool. So I think that that's an important thing to understand behind this. And this is an area that they've been focused on with this web scalers and others, that they think perhaps there's too much consolidation and too much impact, and there needs to be some intervention. Whether you think the intervention is narrowly scoped and proper, I don't think the intent is anti-American bias. And I think early on, maybe a year or two ago, we were still hearing a lot of that victimology complaining, and I don't think that was constructive. But I think industry in the last, I'd say 18 months, I've heard it far more constructive engagement. So that may be an area where I think there are some changes that could be pursued that would be productive.
Yeah, it's a really tricky issue. I should flag I used to work for the European Commission competition regulator back in the day. It's a long time ago now, but I know that they were very proud of sort of really seizing the mantle as the top regulator in the world, and no one wants to give that space up. So it gives them an incentive to keep innovating the rules to catch more people. And then you obviously have the situation where consumer harm was usually measured on price effects in a lot of other systems around the world. But you guys, your companies have innovated so well. You've got business models that don't necessarily rely on a financial transaction now. You get services free to people. And then they've really worked hard to try and find ways to measure the harm. But when you're the innovator, sometimes you get it wrong, is my sort of take when I take a step back from my old job and put my journalist hat on. But if we move now more into that sort of theme of when does a push for digital sovereignty, which is another EU perspective, when does it bleed into digital protectionism? And I wanted to take the example of cloud services and the European Gaia X project. Now, as best I understand it, the French and German governments really saw this as a public cloud project, as a way to assert digital sovereignty, and to make sure that they could keep European data or the data of Europeans under European jurisdiction and keep American hands off it. Not necessarily the companies, but American authorities. I wanted to get your sense of, is this a project that has stayed sort of true to its original goals, and whether you're willing to engage in it, or has it become something you now just don't want to be involved in because it's moved into that protectionist zone? Maybe let's start with Microsoft, CJ.
Thanks, Ryan. We've participated in Gaia X, and think that it is it can be a constructive forum. I think maybe what worries us a little bit more are some of the things that are happening in individual governments, and the question of just where does a legitimate interest in privacy bleed over into protectionism. I really think it just comes at the point where the nationality of a company is the deciding factor. I mean, we've through our European Data Boundary Project and our work on sovereign cloud initiatives, and we've tried to be a partner for European governments in addressing their concerns. But ultimately, what we need is non-discriminatory standard setting. And I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but it probably also there is something for the U.S. to do in this as well, in terms of privacy legislation and FISA reform. I think, over the long run, that's what that's what the answer is going to be. But we're certainly, while we're sympathetic to some of the motivations, we're concerned about the trends.
Yep, fair points. Chris, how about you?
Well, we also have expressed interest in working on Gaia X. I guess my observation would be, the idea of building a completely separate public cloud it's really hard. I mean, it's not easy to build a public cloud. There are reasons why the market is fairly consolidated, and it's because it requires a lot of investment, a lot of capital, as well as a lot of expertise. I'm not sure that it's necessarily the best way to achieve the goal. If the goal is to protect the privacy of European data, there are regulatory mechanisms to do that, including GDPR or other changes to it. Countries all the time, require, in some cases, the localization of certain very sensitive kinds of data, like health data or national security data. So there are mechanisms to accomplish that objective if that's what folks are concerned about, as opposed to trying to build a completely separate public cloud architecture that excludes companies because they happen to be headquartered in the United States. I just think that's not likely to succeed in the market, even if, regardless of what the public policy arguments are.
Thanks for that, Chris. Rita, how about you? You've also got a big cloud business.
Yeah, and in fact, we've been part of, I think it was 200 company that was joining the initiative from day one of Gaia X, that is. So we've been there from the beginning and supportive of the idea of Gaia X and provided technical, expertise. But maybe taking a step back and thinking about your question of the boundaries between the sovereignty and protectionism, and when we think about it from our cloud business perspective, what really drives us is to meet the customers where they are, from privacy, for security, for sovereignty. So we came up with our own concept of what that means for data operational or software sovereignty, and we partnered with European companies like T-System or Thales being an example to kind of meet the customers where they are. But to what CJ said, I think it's also important to recognize that there are voices who wish to limit market access to companies that are European, and there's a desire to have non-European companies to some extent excluded from the market, as Chris also pointed out, and that is a problem. And it's also a problem, I think, from a European perspective, because you limit access to technology and innovation for your own people and enterprises, and I second what Chris said, that it's probably not necessarily in the benefit of Europe on the long term. But maybe one alternative to point out is a similar but different take on this concept, which is this open strategic autonomy, which does not exclude working with partners and others, and that may be something worth looking at.
Thanks for that. Brian.
I don't have much to add here. I mean, I think that the nature of what we do, although we do work in cloud network services, some is more closely being pushed and followed by our customers. But I think we're certainly watching, and I think you're hearing some of the same undercurrents and themes about protectionism and looking for commonalities as opposed to industrial policy, which is seeping into just about everything.
Mm-hmm. Now, I wanted to throw it forward a little bit to the way we regulate emerging technologies, or Web 3.0. I never know which label to use. And AI is the case study that I have in my head when I ask the question. And sort of the context that I wanted to put it in is that I think that there are some regulators that feel they were asleep at the wheel with Web 2.0 and that they're playing a catch-up game now. They allowed too much of a runway for self-regulation, and that caused problems as regulators. On the other hand, if they go too hard, too fast now with things like AI, you risk not getting everyone on the same page, or creating such rigid systems that the vulnerability is you leave the field open to China to win that sort of race, or Chinese companies. So sort of with that context in mind, wanted to get your thoughts about what is the most sensible way forward for putting some guardrails on how AI develops. Maybe start with you, Chris.
Well, I think the best thing to do is to take a risk-based approach. I mean, AI is a massively broad subject. AI can be used to give you a restaurant recommendation. It can also be used to help a doctor diagnose a disease. Those are two very, very different risks. And what I welcome in the initial drafts of the European AI regulation is that they are taking a risk-based approach. They're saying, certain types of very high-risk AI will be clearly regulated. Other types we're not so concerned about. Now, drawing those definitions, where you draw those lines in various sectors, is of course where the real work gets done in a regulation like this. But I think stepping back and realizing that there's a real need to look at a risk-based approach based not so much on the inherent capability of the algorithm, but based on how the algorithm is used. It's more focused on the use case than on the inherent capability of the technology. The same algorithm used to do one thing could be very much in need of regulation to do if that same algorithm is used to do something else. So that's the approach we've recommended, and I think so far that's the approach that the Commission has taken.
Great. CJ, let's go back to you.
Well, I completely agree with Chris on the need for a risk-based approach, given how sprawling the area is. I guess the other two things that I would just throw into the mix that I think are good things to think about whenever you're talking about an emerging area where the answers aren't clear would be transparency and governance. I think that greater transparency by companies about how they're using AI, about their algorithms. Now, sometimes this gets into proprietary technology, but that's where I think you can get into governance, and you can have, audits and, independent entities set up by companies themselves to help police some of these things. And, I think, and to the extent that we're talking about regulation, I would urge policymakers to think about ways that they can incentivize companies to kind of go further on their own. I mean, when I was in private practice, I did a fair amount of FCPA work, and that's an area where governments kind of set some standards, but then companies kind of took it and ran with it, and now have stricter compliance efforts within companies than the Justice Department could ever create on its own. So I think those are just two other principles I would think about for navigating this uncertain area.
Rita, can I get a third vote for risk-based approach?
Yeah, I was thinking as I was listening to Chris and CJ that unfortunately I can't really kind of bring a very controversial view here, and we do agree. I mean, if you think about AI, like AI is not anything new. Like we've been using it, like our spam filters, for example, are using AI. So the question is like, how do you take it to the next level? How do you, I think it was Chris who mentioned it earlier, like think about it from an ethical responsibility angle. You mentioned, international competition, definitely very fierce in this field, and we're watching it very closely to be able to stay ahead of the game. And this is where, just bringing it back to my point in the beginning around the TTC and whether this is an area where the US and the EU can come together. And maybe to react to Chris' earlier point about, is EU regulation, inherently bad? It's not. Sundar was probably one of the first CEOs being out there saying we need to regulate AI. And the European Commission's proposal is definitely very, very interesting. And it seems, based on the TTC, that it's also the risk-based approach. Maybe that's why we all agree on it, because that seems to be the right way to do it. As Chris mentioned, AI is like math. You don't necessarily regulating the numbers. What you really think about is the use case and focusing on those that are really high risk. So I'm sorry I can't bring a third different perspective to this, but definitely welcoming cooperation in this field.
Great.
Oh,
and Brian, sorry I've come to you last a couple of times.
No, maybe I can be, I don't think I'm going to say anything necessarily different, but I would say this about risk-based approaches. And when you use that vernacular, fear makes a really bad policy frame. And when we talk about risk, I don't want to run the risk, quite frankly, of suggesting that there's reason to be fearful here. The more something is forward-leaning, the more it is not well understood, the more fear that may creep in, and that pushes prophylactic regulation and intervention before we fully understand the technology. This is not, by the way, something that is an exclusive issue for web scalers and the edge. AI is going to be a critical part of networks moving forward. And I would say one area that we don't talk about a lot, although Nokia did an algorithm world event some months ago, is that researchers, if they're unable to get access to data, algorithms are largely worthless. If you can't get and share data with researchers, if you can't learn from what happens. And we don't want any regulatory regime that comes in place to really crimp down on the sharing of information. And so we want to focus on things like, what are the circumstances under which you can broadly share large data sets that will help inform a variety of algorithms, both for research and industrial use. And that's kind of hard to imagine because we have this underlying distrust and lack of a privacy shield. But I do think part of the conversation has to be the circumstances under which we can share information broadly in the industry and with researchers about big data sets to drive and improve the use of algorithms. And then hopefully a self-governance model can be a discussion point. But I worry about talking about things as a risk-based approach because that seems to underscore the point that there's something to fear here. And I don't think that's what we want to communicate.
Thanks, Brian. And I'll keep it with you for one last final question. We've got about 30 seconds for each person to contribute before we wrap up. And it's just around the context of President Biden's democracy summit this week. Obviously, democracy has felt, or it feels like it's been on the defensive, in decline for a while. This maybe is the turning point for rallying some more trust, some more reforms to show that democracy delivers. Just wondering what each of you think your company or the tech sector in general can contribute to that effort. Starting with you, Brian.
Wow. In 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds.
I guess I'd say, democracy's messy, right? Autocracy has advantages when you control and command the economy. And a lot of what we talked about here is about coordinating, and you've got cultural differences between allies and trying to keep all those interests in mind, but you have to find areas of commonality to move forward. I think that's very, very difficult to do. It requires an abundance of trust and statesmanship that we haven't seen, quite frankly, in this country or in many others over the last few years. So I'm pessimistic, sadly, but I'm glad that we're having the summit. And I'm glad we're having the conversations. As far as what we can do, I think we just have to continue to promote, as we do as a global company, moving away from localism and tribalism and, pushing for commonality and shared interest.
Thanks, Brian. Rita, your turn.
In 30 seconds, well, our whole mission is centered around, one of the core democratic values, which is access to information. And when you look around the world, like, this is really being challenged. And so in that spirit, we really welcome this summit coming together. And the longer version of what I would say here is going to be delivered by our President of Global Affairs at the Democracy Summit. So please tune in for that.
Brilliant pitch there. I'll take it. Chris, you're next.
I think one of the most concrete things democratic states could do is work together on a common architecture of regulation for the export of surveillance technology to countries that do not have democratic values. A great example is U.S. export control policy for years has restricted the export of things like fingerprinting technology to countries with poor human rights records. But there are no regulations on what you can do about exporting facial recognition technology or cryptologic intercept technology. The regs simply haven't kept up with technology. That's an area where democratic states could and should work together.
Thank you, Chris. And the final word to you, CJ.
Well, we're also big supporters of the summit. Our president, Brad Smith, is going to be speaking on one of the panels later this week. But I don't think that the tech sector has to wait for governments. And I guess that's my biggest would be my biggest point. We recently joined together with a number of other companies on something called the Trusted Cloud Commitment, where we all came together and said, we're not going to participate in a race to the bottom in competing for cloud deals overseas in ways that might undermine democratic values and privacy. I think it's something that hasn't gotten as much attention as it should have, but I think it really is kind of the model for how tech companies ought to operate in this environment.
That's fantastic. I want to thank each of you for your contributions. It's now time for us to wrap up and hand over to the next part of today's proceedings. So thank you to each of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for leading that great discussion on the transatlantic digital relationship. My name is Garrett Workman, and I'm Senior Director for European Affairs here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Clearly, the United States and Europe have a unique opportunity through the new Trade and Technology Council to foster a more coherent and cooperative approach to digital and trade issues. The Chamber is playing a leading role in that effort. Ensuring a more coordinated policy environment is particularly important for small and medium-sized companies, who sometimes lack the time, expertise, or resources needed to deal with conflicting or divergent regulatory approaches. Small and medium-sized companies are also the backbone of both the US and European economies. We're glad that the Trade and Technology Council is particularly focused on expanding opportunities for smaller companies to take advantage of the world's most integrated and connected economic relationship, that between the United States and Europe. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Joanne Sanders, President of EY's Marketing and Communications, who is joining us from outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Joanne, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us and for our Transatlantic Business Work Summit.
Thank you for having me.
First, maybe I'll ask if you could tell us a little bit about your company and how you've helped your clients expand their international footprint.
Yeah, again, thank you for having me. EY's Marketing and Communications. We are a communications agency. We've been in operations for about 14 years. We started off as a target marketing company that helped companies either expand into new industries like healthcare, aerospace, and then expanded further into helping them expand into new markets, into Asia, into Europe, and we've been doing that ever since. We help our clients by making sure that they are lining up their marketing and communications efforts to the market that they're serving, and making sure that we are, culturally sensitive, that we're doing the right kind of communications based on those markets, and then helping them identify different opportunities to continue to grow and foster their sales efforts.
That's great. And obviously making cultural connections and understanding your audience is key to success in international business. What have you learned from helping your companies better understand their audience and how to connect with their customers in Europe?
I think, like I said, we've been doing this for 14 years, and there's a couple of things that we have learned. First of all, you can't assume anything. So even if two countries are speaking the same language, you can't assume that their culture is the same. There's language nuances that you have to take into consideration, particularly in communications. So we've really learned to make sure that you are sensitive every step of the way as you're rolling out any kind of activity. And it's important to be conscientious of that, because so much of international is about relationships. And so any of that information, we feed it to sales teams, we feed it to distributors, we feed it to any entity, any type of sales channel that they have in order to help them grow internationally. And that awareness in itself helps them be, more successful in an international environment.
That's really helpful. So, and another issue is that regulatory differences between markets are often particularly challenging for SMEs to overcome. Could you share some examples of how you've had to differentiate your work and your clients' websites, for example, to comply with different rules in different countries?
Yeah. So, for example, we've worked with a healthcare company, and people are familiar here in the U.S. with the FDA. So FDA is the clearinghouse for here in the U.S. In Europe, it's CE. So we've actually had to build websites where, depending on the IP address that was visiting a specific website, then the consumer was basically able to see specific products. So if a European visitor went to the site, they would only see CE approved products. If an American went to the website, they would only see FDA approved products. So we've had to align our marketing and our websites accordingly. We've also had to, work with email marketing and digital marketing that's, so popular right now. We've had to be very sensitive to different regulations that they have with regards to those types of communications. So we certainly try to, we certainly come across those examples all the time. We have an aerospace manufacturer that, we do campaigns for in Ireland. We do campaigns in Italy, in Europe, in Spain, sorry. And all of those have to be in different languages. All of those have to be, there's different sensitivities with regards to databases and privacy. And we've had to, adapt our marketing in order to make sure that we're compliant when we're doing communications in those markets.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up quickly on that point about privacy. One of the challenges that companies, especially small companies, faces are that there's often different enforcement and different interpretation of the rules, even when they're ostensibly the same. So, for example, in the EU, all companies have to comply with the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, but we all know that that's not necessarily uniformly applied across all countries in Europe. What experiences have you had with that, and how have your companies and your clients sort of overcome those challenges?
Yeah, it absolutely. It would be wonderful to have a consistent, GDPR especially, to have that consistently across the countries would be incredible. But we've had to navigate the fact that that's not the case. For example, in Italy, it is a lot stricter there than, let's say, Spain, with regards to GDPR. And so we've had to make sure that all of our databases have gone through different levels of authentication, different levels of permissions in order to make sure that we are compliant. Our clients have had to adopt other things as far as making calls or being on the ground more and trying to overcompensate for some of the limitations that come with that in order to create enough of a campaign that impacts the specific audience. But it would be wonderful to have some uniformity. And I think too, with COVID, especially digital became something so important. It would be incredible to have some uniformity to help all the small businesses and not have to worry about stepping on landmines, but really focusing on business, on growth, and on opportunities.
Yeah, this is probably a really good opportunity for me to make two policy points that apply here. One, we also are really strongly in favor of having a federally uniform approach to privacy in our own country. We have states like California and Virginia and other Washington State moving forward with their own versions of GDPR-like legislation, but they're all slightly different from each other. And I think the last thing we need is for companies to try to have to deal with 50 different privacy approaches in our own country. So in addition, for everyone's sake, it would be helpful if GDPR was implemented and enforced evenly. It would clearly be helpful for companies operating across the United States for the same thing to be true here. Yeah. And similarly, we also need a privacy shield agreement, which would help small companies and companies of all sizes ensure that they can continue to transfer data subject to obvious privacy rules and regulations, and not the fact that just because they're in the United States, they shouldn't be treated differently from companies operating in other markets. We have a lot of safeguards for our data as well, and our small, medium-sized enterprises shouldn't be disadvantaged by the lack of legal certainty there.
Yes, I'm in full support. That would be wonderful.
Joanne, I think we only have a minute or so left. I don't know if you had any other examples where you'd like to talk about how you've helped maybe European companies expand into, get their message out and expand in the U.S. market.
I think the biggest thing has been helping them connect to resources that are on the ground. we have, depending on the state that you're in, here in Georgia and Atlanta, we have a great trade office. And so connecting them to trade resources is really great. There's a lot of resources all around, but the common denominator across everything is making sure that you're establishing relationships and helping them make those connections, whether with resources, with people, and helping them with their message, even with their sales team, with their marketing, just across the board to really foster those kind of activities that will lead to more business.
Great. And of course, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce can also be a friend and ally in that partnership,
Yes.
as well as our local and state chamber partners across the country. And I know there's a lot of successful ones there in Atlanta. So Joanne, thank you so much again for joining us and sharing your experiences. It's really inspiring to hear of so many great stories about how you've been able to help companies expand their market share. And I really look forward to future opportunities for us to engage on these important issues. And for now, though, it's my pleasure to hand the floor over to Kelsey Bruger from E&E News, who's going to lead an important panel discussion on sustainability and how the private sector is innovating and leading in critical ways that are going to help our societies respond to the climate crisis and reduce carbon emissions. So Kelsey, over to you.
Hello to our audience. Hi, I'm Kelsey Bruger. I'm a reporter for E&E News covering the White House and energy regulations. So the Biden administration and the von der Leyen Commission have said tackling climate change is among their top priorities. As we look to confront the threats posed by climate change, we also need to address the question of how regulations could encourage or stifle innovation. So what is the private sector doing to develop technologies needed to achieve bold goals and meet energy supply challenges? And what can we do to facilitate collaboration among policymakers and stakeholders on these issues? We'll explore that and more during today's conversation. Quick side note to our audience, you can type questions in the chat box to the right of the screen, and we'll get to them later in the conversation. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Allison Book, Vice President of Energy Transition at Baker Hughes. We have Maggie Lemmerman, Head of Federal Affairs at Ørsted North America. And we have Penny Noss, President of International Public Affairs and Sustainability at UPS. So let's just dive right in. UPS, Baker Hughes, and Ørsted are all working on the green transition in unique ways. So let's talk about why that is. What is your company doing to create a more sustainable future? And how do you think you could do it better? And also, what role does the transatlantic relationship play in your approach? I'm going to put Penny on the spot and see if you will kick us off.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelsey. Can I just do a sound check? Can you hear me? Okay. Yes. Super. Well, thank you so much. And I really look forward to today's discussion with my co-panelist. And thanks for kicking us off, Kelsey. When we think about the green transition, and when we think about it both from the US and the European perspective, we think about the three ways that we need to get to net zero. First, for our company, it's about how to make sure that our processes are as efficient as possible. And there, the previous panel and some of the discussions around technology are extremely important. How can we ensure that as we move packages around the world and work with our customers around the world, we're rationalizing and being as efficient as possible in terms of the miles we drive to do our deliveries? And there's a whole lot of stuff we're doing in that space, but efficiency is the first thing we look at and focus on. The second thing we're focused on from our green transition is the issues around transitional technologies and transition. There's a lot of things that as we walk on our path towards full electrification, which is our end goal, there are some things that we think we're going to need to do as we continue along the path and as we wait for certain technologies to be developed. So for example, sustainable aviation fuel is something that we're looking at. because the technology doesn't currently yet exist to have full-size cargo planes that are electrified and flying. We're hopeful we'll get there, but in the meantime, we're going to do what we can by working with some of these transitional technologies. Last and finally, our final goal is electrification, and there we're doing quite a bit of work to move forward with, where possible, electrifying and using renewable energy sources to provide our electricity. And that's kind of the pathway we're going. Now, in the transatlantic context, it's extremely important. We connect the United States and Europe. We connect buyers and sellers in the United States and Europe. So the more that we can work together with both the US and the European governments, the more they're developing common standards, the more we can work with our airports in both the United States and Europe to find sustainable aviation fuel, to make our processes more efficient, the better off we're going to be as a society, as a company, and the more we're going to be able to provide certainty to our customers. So that's a little bit about us at UPS. We want to be carbon neutral by 2050, and we've outlined some ambitious goals in our roadmap on how to get there. We hope we hit our targets sooner than are currently out there. And again, I think the work that the US and the EU are doing together will help us in meeting those goals. And so with that, I will be happy to pass it off to one of my other panelists.
Yeah, Allison, you want to go next?
Sure. So a little bit about us, really quick. Baker Hughes is an energy technology company, and we also work to serve a customer base within the oil field services and equipment sector. So we kind of wear two hats. The work that we're doing. So my title is sometimes misleading, but it's just I work on energy transition, right? What does that mean? So there's the energy transition for us internally, and then there's the energy transition solutions that we are working and trying to innovate on for our customers. Okay, so our customers are not just oil and gas; it's a broader universe beyond that. So internally, much of what you just heard applies for us in terms of thinking about what we're going to do internally to meet our net zero pledge. And so we were among, if not the first, in our part of the energy sector to align to the Paris Agreement. And so we've been working to lay out our roadmap, and so we have a nice roadmap on how we're going to get to net zero. And a lot of that is based off of partnerships and things that we're going to be using in conjunction with our tech, with our customer. And so it's everything from the normal things that you'd think about as energy efficiency, looking at a switch away from natural gas to biogas in certain areas. There's a lot that to unpack over there. For long-term solutions beyond also methane management and making sure that you can reduce venting and fugitive flaring, that whole spectrum of emissions is where we're headed. Is we have several growth areas inside the company, and those are geothermal energy, also CCS, hydrogen, and emissions management. We have some others. We have an increasing focus on the role of digital in the energy transition, which is pretty exciting and plays a lot in the emissions management space. But the last part is we also work around the renewables ecosystem. So obviously I mentioned geothermal. The other part is we do exist around wind turbines in something called condition monitoring. So we monitor how those are operating. And so the way we think about the energy transition is both internal and external, to sum it up. And we look at this through the lens of how do we work in collaborations with our customers, the government, and stakeholders to ensure project success that gets society to net zero. All right. And so you asked several things in your question, but I think we'll probably unpack the rest of those as we go on. So I'll hand it over to our last panelist.
Yeah, Maggie.
Sure. Thanks, Kelsey. And thanks so much to the Chamber for having Ørsted as part of this panel. So for those maybe not so familiar with our company, Ørsted is a Danish headquartered global clean energy developer. And we are the largest offshore wind developer in the world with nearly 8 gigawatts in operation. But to this question of the green energy transition, it's one that is really central to Ørsted and our mission and sort of who we are at our core. Up until the mid 2000s, Ørsted was one of the most coal and oil intensive utilities in Europe, producing nearly 1/3 of all Danish carbon emissions. And in 2008, so relatively recently, we formulated a radical vision to really transform our business model from fossil fuels to green energy, with offshore wind at the core of that goal, with the desire to stay both relevant and competitive. And we're really proud to say that today we have completed that transition to a renewable energy only company. And as I said, with offshore wind really carrying most of that. And then beyond that, we recognize we're not fully there yet, and are looking to become carbon neutral by 2025, and by 2040 reaching net zero emissions across our entire supply chain, which is obviously a huge challenge, but one that we are anxious to meet. And to the question about the transatlantic relationship and sort of how that plays a role in our thinking, obviously we are a European company, but we have quickly sort of established a presence here in the United States. And while we really cut our teeth on deploying offshore wind and growing that technology in Europe and the UK, we now have this incredible opportunity to deploy offshore wind at a significant scale in the US. It's really just starting to gain traction on the East Coast and with this administration. And because we have really been able to advance the technology and bring the costs down and create supply chains and efficiencies in Europe, there's this great opportunity to bring that knowledge to the US and sort of quickly deploy offshore wind here. So as a company, Ørsted is really thrilled to be able to play a role in creating this new clean energy opportunity here in the US.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for those intros. I want to talk a little bit more about the transatlantic sort of relationship. The U.S. and EU leaders have the opportunity to sort of reinvigorate that collaboration in the fight against climate change. We're 1 year into the Biden administration. Just today, we have a new German chancellor, and so I guess, looking ahead to 2022, where do you all see opportunities for the U.S. and EU leaders to work together? And I'll send it back to Maggie.
Yeah, sure. So obviously at Ørsted, we think a lot about offshore wind because that is sort of the core of our business. And so really, I think that the opportunity lies with a lot of the lessons learned from deploying offshore wind in Europe. I mean, they are, a decade or so ahead of where the U.S. is at today, and so there's a lot of opportunities to learn not only, technology solutions and how efficiencies have been gained in deploying offshore wind, but what policies worked and what policies didn't work in the EU, and what some of the incentives are that U.S. policymakers could consider, as well as challenges around leasing offshore waters and developing a workable federal permitting regime. I mean, these are all things that the U.S. is really starting to dive into and grapple with, and they're big challenges. And not to say that every European solution will be applicable here in the U.S., but I think there's a lot of really healthy dialogue that we would love to see more of in the coming years, particularly around offshore wind, so that the U.S. can really capitalize on this opportunity.
Okay, Penny, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe pick up a little bit on Maggie's points, but if there's a couple of things where I think there's an opportunity for a reinvigorated U.S. and EU relationship to really focus. When I think about some of the work that's going on in the transatlantic, the new TTC, the new dialogue that's taking place, there are opportunities for the United States and Europe to work together on some of the critical things that are going to be needed for the green economy. So things like minerals and semiconductors, silicon for solar panels. And so a lot of these things are being talked about, I think, as we look at some of the supply chains that we're going to need and to develop. And as the United States and Europe talk about friendshoring, which I think is a topic of discussion tomorrow, we see some opportunities there for some of the development around some of the critical supplies that we're going to all need in order to move forward with some of these technologies. The second thing I would call out is I think that the United States and Europe have an opportunity to use the size of their markets to ensure that climate-friendly products are being produced and sold within the United States and Europe. And rather than make it a competition, I think it's something that if the United States and Europe can align on, that could be an incredibly important development, and one where the US and the EU really use their big economic muscles to drive global change around some of the manufacturing and production of certain products. So for example, the recent steel and aluminum agreements that the United States and Europe have agreed to that look at carbon intensity, that look at green steel, that's the kind of the beginning of what I think could be some really interesting developments between the United States and Europe, where they work collaboratively and cooperatively rather than competitively with regards to the carbon content of products and using our relative market weights to drive that globally.
Okay, thanks. Allison, you want to weigh in here? Or?
Sure. So a couple things. This is the advantage of going last on the question. So because both Peggy and Maggie said some great things. So let me add on to a couple that they didn't pick up on. One is to Peggy's point. It's on when we look at the carbon in products. This is like $1 billion question. Okay, there's a big market around, and a lot of it right now I would say is customer consumer driven. It depends on who your customer is, whether it's a human or it's a company. We increasingly see more and more of our customer base wanting to see what either the carbon intensity or the absolute emissions behind the making of or its use in the field. And so there's an area in there in sort of the greenhouse gas accounting part of the story that is often overlooked. Okay, and so right now there's policy moving in the U.S. and has already moved in the EU, where there are minimum requirements for reporting greenhouse gas emissions by company. When you really look closely, it's entirely possible that there's going to be some piece of this that's around products. It's in the Scope 3 part of emissions reporting. And while that doesn't look like technology, that category is all about what you sell, okay, as a company. And so to the extent that the EU and the US can work to harmonize basic principles around things like greenhouse gas accounting, that makes it easier as a manufacturer to wrap your brain around how you report in multiple jurisdictions in the world. And so that right there it would be a major help to companies like Baker Hughes, Orsted, and others, right? Mm-hmm. If we're thinking about what we're delivering as a product to customer consumer. Another point is something that happened recently, which is the Global Methane Pledge. I think was really great to see. And as a company, we very much supported the fact that so many countries got on board with really thinking hard about curbing methane emissions specifically. And so I would applaud that as a positive move, because oftentimes we're critical about what they could do, and we don't celebrate the things that governments do. All right. The last part of this is, and I think there were some elements in both of what Peggy and Maggie said, is that there's kind of a push and pull about what's happening with the energy transition and moving to a low carbon state. We really have to think about the role of government is oftentimes people think about the regulatory structure. So we can have packaged incentives, and then there's also the stick part, so we can have a carrot and stick. But my thought and our company's thoughts are that when we look at the regulatory paradigm, different jurisdictions can either be prescriptive or they can be very performance-based. I encourage policymakers to think about harmonized outcomes, so to speak, versus a prescriptive framework that we operate under. And so if we can have a goal and it's performance-based, then the type of energy that's used or how you do it becomes less important as long as you get the outcome that's sought. And what we're talking about here is about an outcome that's holding the US and the EU and the world to the Paris Agreement. And so if we keep that in mind, then governments can build less prescriptive and more performance-based, which opens the door for tech innovation and doesn't shut the door on certain technology.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's kind of brings us to our next question, which I'd like to maybe kick to one of our other panelists, which is just sort of the role of, a clean energy transition is not just going to be the private sector. It's going to include government and citizens as well. Many of the technologies that are needed are not sort of ready yet for large scale deployment. So I'm wondering if you could each sort of identify maybe a barrier that you see to innovation. Anyone want to take a stab?
I'm happy to jump in. So I think, again, going back, I think that there are some barriers that we're currently seeing in supply chains. And I think those are short-term solutions, but they are something that we need to be thinking about in the long run with regards to how our supply chains and some of the materials we're going to need, where do they come from? How can we work together on ensuring that we all have access to those items in order to ensure that we can move forward with innovations? Batteries are an incredibly important product in terms of the path to electrification. And so that's an area, again, I think of tremendous opportunity between the United States and Europe. I also think, though, if I could do a glass half full, I think we actually have quite a few tools available today from a technology perspective that can help us with the customer and the consumer side of making the right choices with regards to the climate. And so that is something that I think we can start working on today, whether it's, making sure that you make the right energy choices, whether it's you make the right choices when you are shipping a product and maybe it doesn't need to be there today, maybe it can be there in a week. That's going to have a climate impact. And I think that we need to be thinking about and doing more to make sure that we're encouraging the right consumer behaviors as well on both sides of the Atlantic when it comes to the climate.
And I can jump in next. And I was sort of thinking about this question in a slightly different way, but thinking about sort of what the sort of joint private sector and government role needs to be in making this transition. And, you asked about identifying a barrier, Kelsey. And I mean, I think, I don't know if this is a single barrier or a whole set of them, but it's really, we're all kind of grappling with this challenge now, right? Of how to fundamentally sort of reshape our infrastructure and how we get our energy from that infrastructure. And I'm picking up on a point that Allison made just a moment ago. It really does need to be about a lot of different energy solutions. And so one in particular that I think kind of ties this together is thinking about green hydrogen. And there's a lot of excitement in both the US and in Europe about green hydrogen playing a role in, refining applications and transportation applications. And there's a whole host of opportunity there. But we really need to overcome a lot of both the sort of private sector innovation and deployment challenges, as well as how is government sort of going to incentivize and help develop sort of fundamental shifts in what our energy infrastructure looks like to bring green hydrogen to market. And so it's something, we're really excited about at Ørsted. It's certainly an opportunity, but there are some real challenges to how to get from here to there when it comes to green hydrogen. But certainly, I think one of the really exciting new technology opportunities that the U.S. and the EU are sort of looking at the same time. And so I think we should think to what are those opportunities for kind of collaboration, both between governments, but also with the private sector as well. So more of one to continue to noodle on than that I have the answer today, but certainly a big challenge.
Okay. Sort of, so I guess sort of along the lines of, kind of government role and partnership here. I mean, I'm wondering, we're 1 year into the Biden administration. And so have you seen any changes, I guess, in the past year with the change? Like, does it have an impact? Any thoughts?
Well, I'm nodding, so I'll back up my nod. I was nodding yes. Okay. What I would say is the pace of things has changed in the area of the energy transition in particular. We see a lot more motion clearly here in the U.S. and the EU has always been going, right? So they were never off. So they just keep doing what they're doing. But here in the U.S., I would say, in what we pay attention to very much as a company, methane in particular, that picked back up, and we're seeing motion. Will it occur, and they'll get to the finish line on like EPA regulations around methane? I don't know how long that will take, but there's certainly a lot more momentum backing up. So my answer is definitively yes. We see a pretty big difference. That also, there's the ability, the amount of funding that is potentially on the table for hydrogen solutions and CCS and geothermal is pretty phenomenal, both in the US and in the EU. And I would say the Biden administration is working pretty hard to drive more innovation in all of the areas of energy transition.
Okay. Either of you want to weigh in?
I would just say I wholeheartedly agree with everything Allison just said. One thing in particular that we've seen the Biden administration do when it comes to kind of their clean energy commitments and specifically around offshore wind, again, coming back to that since that is our core business, is taking a whole of government approach. So not simply saying, this is an issue for Department of Interior to issue federal permits for offshore wind, so we'll let, Secretary Haaland figure it out. The Biden administration has very much said, we want, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Labor, all to be kind of coming together and thinking about how their agency has the tools to accelerate our transition to a green energy economy and sort of bringing the full weight of government to bear on working through the challenges to get us there. So I would just note, I think that's been a really strategic choice this administration has made. And while it's not easy, I mean, challenges remain, but it has certainly, I think, kind of refocused a number of agencies to tackle this transition.
Okay. We have a couple audience questions I might kind of sprinkle in here. Someone is asking about the workforce and, as this transition happens, what are companies thinking about attracting and maybe reskilling talent as we move into a cleaner future? Anyone want to volunteer? Penny, do you want to?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question because I think there will be a lot of, it's going to be kind of four-dimensional chess as we work through the transitions coming up. There's energy transitions, there's going to be supply chains transitions, and there will be workforce transitions in some of it. So just at a very basic level, we were talking about this internally the other day as we're thinking about large-scale deployment of electric vehicles. We were thinking about how do we need to train our drivers to change their methods in terms of driving. An electric vehicle is, for any of you, most of you probably have seen a big UPS truck driving around your neighborhood. We have a policy of trying to honk when we pull away from the curb in order to protect the public. But our cars do rattle a little bit nowadays. But when we move to electric vehicles, they will become much quieter. So just, I mean, a very small but very important thing that we were talking about was how do we train our drivers and what do we need to be changing in terms of our driving techniques in order to continue to protect the public with these new quieter vehicles. So we're looking at things like that already. We're looking at the skills we need in our company to work on some of these green transitions in the future. And so that I think I will kind of leave it there, but that is an area that I think is something that we're already starting to think through, and how do we need to also adapt some of our workforce planning, our workforce skilling, some of our upskilling, some of the mechanics, how we're going to change the mechanics that service our vehicles to work on these new electric vehicles that we will be bringing online.
Okay, great. Thanks. Allison or Maggie? Allison, you want to
Sure.
chime in?
So for us as a company that has one foot squarely in that oil field side of the shop, that's really core to where Baker Hughes came from is in the oil field services side. And then where we go as more of a technology-driven company that has a lot of energy transition solutions, there is a bit of a change, but we have a lot of the core skills already. And so I'm always reluctant to use the word upskilling, because in some ways that term becomes a little pejorative to people who are a highly technical, skilled workforce, like engineers and geoscientists and IT engineering kind of architects. And so they're very, very technical. The skills generally do translate and map to sort of new application. But what Penny said that was really important was thinking. I loved your example, and this is a part of why companies like us work with UPS and other delivery companies. They're being innovative and thinking about the safety as well as the energy transition, which is great. Like changing the behavior as we change the technology and the application of what we're doing in practice is a really important part of that. And I think that's one of the very first steps in how we look at a changing workforce is how do we get them to adapt a little bit to working in a slightly different way, not a totally different way, or applying their really great skill base to a new set of problems. And so that's something that we're thinking pretty hard about. But along with that is a change to companies' employee value proposition. And so part of the transition that we're going to be up against in a company like ours is that some people may not want to transition with their skill set to a different kind of role ultimately. And maybe they decide they want to go someplace else. We want to see that we can keep that good talent. And so we've got to meet that head on by making sure that the value proposition for today's version, in our case, Baker Hughes, still works for employees versus the value proposition that some mid-career and later career people came in under. The other part of that is with young people coming in, and I see young in their career path, maybe not even young in age, but young in their career, the value proposition, is their view of that is pretty different. And so we look at that. So I hire a lot in the area of sustainability, and that's not too hard to get people who want to come in for that. But I will say it's really competitive. So the last part of the employee challenge in workforce is making that value proposition for people attractive enough that they decide to pick you. Because I want to give one example. We put a job description out on the street 5 months ago, and the market is so competitive for people who do emissions accounting that we had maybe a handful of people that applied, and we tried it again and we tried it again, right? And it's just really competitive out there for sort of the future state jobs that we're finding that we need more and more of. And so some of those we can't reskill because it's just a fundamentally different kind of base knowledge when they come in. And so there are many different challenges, but I think all three of our companies probably are trying to tackle this in different ways, but they usually start with employee behavior and training.
And if I can just jump into, just because I think this workforce question is such a great one, and something obviously we're all spending a lot of time thinking about as companies. At Ørsted, or generally sort of in the offshore wind industry in the U.S., there is this similar dual challenge where there's an opportunity to tap into the existing workforce in the U.S., particularly when we look at our needs for vessel construction and vessel operations. There's a huge, skill set, particularly in the Gulf, where they had built vessels for offshore energy production for decades, and so those skills exist, and we have signed several contracts with Gulf Coast shipbuilders to build the vessels that we'll need for offshore wind, and so. It's providing this opportunity to apply those skills to the green energy transition, which is a really exciting opportunity and place to be. At the same time, as we're looking at, building these offshore wind farms, 20 miles off the coast of New England, no one's done that in the U.S. before, and that's a whole new workforce and set of skills that we need to develop. And so, as we're getting ready as Ørsted to build our first commercial scale project, the South Fork Wind Farm off of Long Island, we actually just recruited our first class of offshore wind technicians. Who we have to send to Denmark to train for a few months before they'll come back and be able to perform the work here in the U.S. And as we start to build commercial scale projects, we can obviously start to do that training here in the U.S. But it's an early challenge for this industry in the U.S. to develop the skills, and unfortunately, there's like a little bit of having to bring them to where the existing wind farms are, which are in our case over in Denmark. So an exciting opportunity, but also one we're going to need to work out over the years and sort of develop the training programs here domestically so that we can continue to grow the jobs associated with operating our projects.
Okay, thanks. We have a question. We want to go back to something that Penny had mentioned about the supply chain issues and friendshoring. And so if you could maybe take us back to that and talk a little bit about like how firms are thinking about those challenges as it relates to building new energy infrastructure. Maybe I don't know if Allison or Maggie has thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, on supply chain in particular, this is an area that we're really starting to dig into quite a bit. As a supplier of manufactured goods or assembled goods that we put in the hands of our customers, our energy customers, we depend a lot on supply chain stability and ensuring that there's transparency in our supply chain. So we have a range of different sorts of programs that help us see into our supply chain better. But I will say, an area that we are thinking pretty hard on is how do we influence our suppliers to start thinking about emissions in a way that is in agreement with our philosophy and our commitment to the energy transition. And so that's an area we certainly look for best practices and lesson learned from other organizations, and really heavily rely on like logistics companies in particular to move our products around the world. And so how we think about interacting with the up part of our supply chain is really, really critical in understanding how we can influence what's a really significant part of our emissions profile. So right now we have looked at launching a supplier program aimed at getting who from we have over 50,000 suppliers. And so with a number that large, this is a really hard problem for our company. So we're trying to get information from the bigger suppliers to say, are you thinking about this, right? And so even that had some mixed results. So we don't have a solution yet, but it's a really a tricky problem, and we're trying to wrap our brains around it. So anyone who's listening, if you have some really good ideas or you want to work and collaborate with us to think about that, please do reach out.
Well, I guess we have to, I can't let you go without touching on the sort of energy crisis in Europe, and which I guess, is of course only expected to get worse as we approach the winter months. So I wonder if you have thoughts about, I guess, this, what we talked about, this transatlantic relationship and how that could factor into longer term plans for energy resilience. Maggie, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, sure. So, it's making me think back to in October, our North American CEO testified in front of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and sort of this question of the energy crisis kind of was brought up again and again. And, he had, I thought, a really interesting answer of, look, because he was there to sort of testify about the opportunity that offshore wind presents. And, he said, look, offshore wind is not going to solve the energy crisis of 2021. But, we have the opportunity to maybe solve the energy crisis of 2027 or, sort of down the road. And I think, the point being that we need to make the investments today to really diversify and strengthen our energy resilience. And, as we think about sort of what Europe and the US, both policymakers and the private sector should be thinking about, it's not just building more renewables, which obviously we support, but also, building in long-term storage solutions and green hydrogen solutions and investing and strengthening our grid. Because, it's easy to point fingers during a crisis at one particular technology, but unless we're willing to, make those public and private investments across a range of complementary solutions, we're just going to repeat the same mistakes again. So I think it's about that joint commitment to continuing to invest across a diverse range of solutions.
If I could add on, because that's a great answer, and I wanted to add that for energy resilience, there's a lot of conversation, whether it was at COP26 or another sort of policy-making discussions around the world about how do you get to low to no carbon as soon as possible, right? And so for many, it's a full-scale, full-stop approach where we just get to renewables right away. This gets back to something I said earlier, where I mentioned that it's an outcome that we seek, right? That we want to get to low carbon. So if we can be innovative, that we should stay there. But a big part of having a transition that both creates resilience, okay, to systems and affordability. So we don't want to leave communities behind, right? That's a big part of the just transition piece of this, not just with how we think about employees and impacted communities, but also that we don't leave energy poverty in the wake of the transition. And so in terms of resilience, the more dynamic the mix, and as we think about it more holistically and keeping as many energy options on the table, the better we're going to be, right? I mean, you can look at what happened with Texas, for example, earlier in the year, and the grid was struggling, right? They had major power outages, and it wasn't gas, it wasn't wind, it wasn't solar, it was literally in all of the above. Let's go back and think about the whole system, right? And so having a little bit more in terms of options at the table is helpful, but it also goes to making sure that you have resilient systems. And some of that goes to the supply chain, right? So there have been notable challenges, even how supply chain impacts energy delivery. So it's just asking policymakers to take a step back, think about the whole system, and don't choose an outcome that removes options to enable resilience and a thriving energy ecosystem.
Okay, thanks. And we're running out of time here. We have maybe just another quick 30 seconds or so and I would be curious, what you're all thinking about looking ahead to 2022, what you're excited about, what you're optimistic about in terms of, improving sustainability at your firm and across the industry. Penny, you want to?
So yeah, just really quickly, two things. One is I'm optimistic because we have incredibly engaged employees, and the energy that our employees have around the issues of climate make my job a little bit easier in terms of helping everybody think about and move through the transition. The second thing that I see for 2022 that's going to be, I think, a big deal for all of us on both sides of the Atlantic is going to be some of the changes that are going on around here in the United States, the Security and Exchange Commission on climate change disclosures, and that there's the opportunity for some alignment on both sides of the Atlantic between how all of us report on and provide greater transparency around what we are doing and the commitments we're making on climate. So those are the two things I'm optimistic about. There'll be a lot of work, but that's for 2022.
All right. Well, thanks so much. Looks like we are out of time, but I'd like to, thank you all for joining us. And I am now going to welcome Tom Quadman, the Executive Vice President of Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for a conversation on funding the green transition. So, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Summit's panel on funding the green transition, a conversation on sustainable finance. As we get started, I would like to thank Citigroup for sponsoring this important discussion and panel. I'm Tom Quadman, and I am Executive Vice President with the U.S. Chamber's Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness. I could tell you from when our team has gone over to Brussels and Basel and Madrid and London, which we did on a fairly regular basis before COVID hit, I would say over the last 4 or 5 years, there's not a meeting that we haven't had with the EU Financial Stability Board or IOSCO where we have not been discussing sustainable finance. As that has sort of come to the forefront, we all know that there's a growing demand for ESG-related information and pressure on the private sector to fund the green transition, both in the European Union and the United States. That topic involves a variety of different themes and components, as well as a varying level of complexity. As stakeholders move forward on the sustainable finance effort, there's a growing recognition on the importance of international cooperation to foster predictability and certainty in the transatlantic relationship. I look forward to this discussion with our panelists and the status of the sustainable finance effort, the challenges facing the transition, as well as the expected next steps. I'd like to introduce our panel of experts. First is Elon Jacobs, who is with Citigroup. Elon joined Citi's Global Government Affairs team in 2015, and he's Director for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. I'd also like to introduce David Henry Doyle from S&P Global. David is the Head of Government Affairs and Public Policy for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa at S&P Global, and serves as the head of the Brussels office. And lastly, I'd like to also introduce Judson Berkeley of UBS. Judson is the Managing Director, Group Head of Engagement, and Regulatory Strategy, Chief Sustainability Office at UBS, based in Zurich. Gentlemen, welcome, and look forward to the discussion today. So let's set the scene first. And Elon, I'm going to start with you, but if everybody can jump in here as well. I think it would be very helpful for our listeners today as we start this discussion, if you can give a little bit of scene setting in terms of where we are with the green transition and what are the major issues that are out there that people really should be aware of. So Elon, if we could start with you, and then maybe if we can go to David and Judson on that.
Tom, and thanks for hosting this very important debate today. And also thanks for your continued advocacy and those trips that you mentioned over to the EU, to Europe. We certainly really appreciate them. We know that even in these recent difficult times, you've managed to make those with the US Chamber. So that is absolutely great. And thank you. Okay, so let's start with the positives when it comes to funding the green transition. In the run-up to COP26, we saw quite a large increase in a number of corporates that are mobilizing on climate action. I think there was over 5,000 different companies that joined the Race to Zero, and that means they all have to commit to setting a 1.5 degree aligned science-based target. effectively net zero, which is fantastic. And then we saw at COP26, we'll remember that big announcement from Mark Carney, over 450 financial institutions holding, I think it's 40% of global financial assets, and 130 trillion US dollars, all committed to align their activities to transitioning to net zero. So that's all great news. And they're going to work to deliver the $100 trillion of investment that's needed to achieve net zero. So some really big numbers and big positives there. And if you'll forgive me for giving a little bit of an intro explainer as to where Citi comes from, because we believe that global financial institutions like us to have the opportunity and the responsibility, in fact, to play a leading role in funding that transition. And to that end, we ourselves made a net zero commitment by 2050, and that includes all of the emissions critically that are associated with our financing. So our scope 3 emissions, which is the really hard stuff. And we're going to do our own operations by 2030, and then those financed emissions by 2050. And then back in April of this year, we committed $1 trillion to sustainable finance by 2030, aligning with the UN SDGs. And half of that, so 500 billion, is for environmental finance. So exactly the kind of green transition that we're talking about: renewable energy projects, green technology, water conservation, all of these kind of things. So clearly, ESG and climate are on top of mind for the financial community, including us and the others on this panel. We can start to transform our market, and it will start to transform the way that risk is priced and that capital is deployed, which is great news. You're seeing already corporates are changing their business models. Asset managers, banks and insurers and so on are all starting to integrate climate into their investment plans, and that should drive more capital towards funding the green transition. But I start with the positive. On the concerning side, really, is quite frankly, we can't transform the global economy on our own. This isn't just going to be driven by finance. The most important thing, really, which would hopefully open the floodgates to private capital supporting the green transition, is really clear signals from government. It's clear policy signals. Support from government, absolutely. De-risking would be really important. But actually, the most important element for me at COP26 was the finance investments. It was the NDCs, the clear climate plans that were made by so many more countries and that were ratcheted up in their ambition. Because without those clear targets and ambitions from governments, finance isn't really going to flow, because ultimately the private sector aligns their ambitions and approach behind the ambitions and approach and the policy direction set by governments. So it was great news that we saw many governments making those commitments, and all of the individual pledges around methane use and coal and energy and deforestation and so on. What we need now really is some clear political and policy commitments and the implementation of those pledges, which I think will help to unlock the finance that is clearly there. But perhaps I'll pass over to David now.
Sure, David.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Ellen. I just wanted to reiterate the support for the U.S. Chamber. You do fantastic work, and I chair a group at the U.S. Or the American Chamber of Commerce in Brussels. The perspective that the U.S. Chamber brings to the transatlantic dialogue is just so essential. So congratulations to you and your team, and thanks for the invite. Look, on your question, where are we now in funding the green transition, and what are the major issues to be aware of? At S&P Global, we're a data information insight company. We help people make decisions in financial markets and with regard to investment opportunities. And we've invested really heavily to provide the right ESG data to enable decisions related to the transition. To give you an example, we've got about analytics for about 110,000 companies on the physical impacts of climate change. And just on climate, we've got about 700 billion data points. So let me talk about the data. The data on climate change makes for really uncomfortable reading. The UN talked about a code red for humanity just before COP, and I think that's right. We are starting to see the narrative change, but the data doesn't lie. And this year we've gathered ESG disclosure from around 10,000 companies around the world, and the companies are on track for at least a 3-degree scenario of global warming. And from our data, we're estimating that over 66% of global companies have at least one asset at a high risk of physical risk from climate change. And unfortunately, we also estimate that under a strong global policy framework to address climate change, companies are going to see something like $285 billion in carbon pricing costs just in 2025. And that's, to put that in perspective, that's 13% of their earnings. So 13% of their earnings at risk potentially from higher carbon price. Those costs are going to significantly rise over time. So according to our research, the world essentially needs 72% reduction in emissions to achieve the goals of Paris. And let's take an external view on this. The International Energy Agency said just before COP that even if all the government's current net zero pledges are implemented in full and on time, the world will only achieve 20% of the overall emissions by 2030. So what we're seeing here from a risk perspective is most of the net zero aspirations are backloaded, somewhere in the 2030s, 2040s. And we saw this with a lot of goodwill being pledged, a lot of aspirations being put on the table at COP from Mark Carney's GFANZ, the framework for net zero. But we're talking about most of the financial risk towards the end of this transition. And that will be compounded by the physical risk from climate change. It's really important to understand that the longer you delay, the more risk you're building up. So maybe a little bit more of a negative picture from the data. I think what's positive, and to Ilan's point, the narrative has changed incredibly. We're seeing people talk about this in the context of mainstream finance. And I think that is something to celebrate, but something to build on as soon as possible.
Judson?
Yeah, likewise, thanks from me to the Chamber for hosting this. I think it's a very important conversation, particularly to try and bridge that Atlantic that we're talking about. I think there's great opportunity here really to drive some convergence across some of the frameworks that are building out. Now, UBS, we're $4 trillion of assets under management. That at some level we have fiduciary duty for our clients on. We're also obviously a large bank. And I think you can read COP26 outcomes as glass half full or glass half empty. I think we're looking at a bit more glass half full. There's some interesting numbers. You have some data points. You go to David's point that you can lean on there. The IEF, where I chair the sustainable finance work, their research shows that the sustainable debt market now is over 3 trillion as of Q3 this year. That's up from 1.5 trillion last year, 1.4 trillion issued just this year. So you're really starting to see some of the flows. And our own UBS research, looking at say a sector view, about 86% of the forward 5-year CapEx in the US automakers going into electrics or autonomous vehicles. In Europe, around 53%, growing quickly. So you're starting really to see major shifts in sectors, which obviously as an investor, you're interested in understanding those shifts, but even more importantly, as a stakeholder in this broader transition, you were very keen to see those shifts really start to happen. So I think there's some great momentum being built, and as David highlighted, the narrative has changed. As Elon highlighted, the shifts are starting to happen in certain cases, and clearly there's a very important supporting element here, which is that real economy regulation that Ilan highlighted. So things like the Fit for 55 package in Europe, are absolutely critical to setting the right frameworks for the real economy and giving the certainty for long-term investments by companies. Likewise, in the U.S., the infrastructure package already through, Build Back Better hopefully does get through in some form. So I think those will be key critical components of trying to give that foundational frameworks for the real economy so that finance can really flow with. And I think that's the way we see it. I absolutely agree with Elon. Finance does not lead here, but we are successful when our clients are successful. I mean, in some sense that this whole story we're in, this whole transition, it's the story of finance and banking. If you look at Citi, founded 1811, Citibank in New York, to help basically the merchants in New York compete with Boston and Philadelphia, and actually the first U.S. bank to go international. UBS, founded 1863, to basically support the industrialization of the Swiss economy. Banks and financial institutions are there to support the needs of the society of their time, and the needs of our societies today is this transition we're in. So we absolutely want to be part of that. We want to work with our clients, help them succeed, help them understand how to transition and get the frameworks in place. And clearly, some of this needs to be about financial sector frameworks. But the one thing that we would sort of suggest or caveat in is we shouldn't spend undue energy trying to get the perfect regulatory frameworks in place. Things just need to move. And that's one of the great, I think, messages coming out of Glasgow is just this commitment that this is, the so-called decade of delivery and really just getting capital flowing. We kind of know where it needs to go. So we can work with maybe 80-20 frameworks at times. The perfect doesn't need to be the enemy of the good here. And I really think there's a chance to really start to see some significant shifts over the next few years.
Thank you all. I think that was very important in terms of setting the stage. And, I think all of us, right, have been working on these issues for years, right? And this is not something that's just cropped up in the last, 12 to 18 months. This has been going on for a very, very long time. And look, both in terms of economics and financial markets, the transatlantic relationship is extremely important, right? I mean, the connections between the United States and Europe are really, an important axis for the rest of the global economy. So if we could think about the transatlantic relationship a little bit, what are the current obstacles? What are the current opportunities that exist in terms of those investing activities, to advance a green transition? And how is that going to help set some of the goals set by Paris? So, and COP26. So, David, if we can maybe start with you, can we talk a little bit about that transatlantic relationship, and then how does that sort of get into the goals that have been set?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I mentioned, I chair the Sustainable Finance Task Force at the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU, which is sort of a sister organization to the USC. And we set up that task force in 2017 because US companies felt they needed to engage with the EU agenda. We wanted to help build the EU system because we operate in the EU, and EU regulation has a funny way of crossing borders and crossing into third countries. So that was a really important milestone, I think. And I think the policymakers in the EU really welcomed the presence of that dialogue. And now with new opportunities in the policy space to have closer dialogue, I think that is, closing that gap at the policymaker level is super important. That's a massive opportunity. And doing it at international level rather than just at the bilateral level is even more important. So the US chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Groups is a really important step. Both jurisdictions working with IOSCO, the IFRS on the foundations of what we're building in the architecture here. That's incredibly important. It's a massive opportunity. I think data and disclosure in the sustainability space is both a huge obstacle to actually getting the scale in the market that we want to see and the change in the transition that we want to see, but also a huge opportunity. So the data that we have at the moment is very fragmented. It's not standardized. It's very difficult to analyze efficiently. It takes our teams in sustainable finance space multiples of the amount of time needed to prepare ESG data as we do for financial data. And I totally agree with Judson. The perfect can't be the enemy of the good here. We didn't build a financial system in 1 year or 2 years, 150 years ago. It's about progress and setting kind of a high quality benchmark for progress in the initial stages that's comparable, that's compatible. That is essential. It's a huge opportunity. We really believe we need better information for ESG. We think capital markets function best when they have high quality information. So we're a huge user of information as well that's disclosed by companies. And getting on an initial baseline about what are the standards we want to see in the disclosure space, how can we make them as compatible as possible? Sure, some jurisdictions will go further. The IOSCO and IFRS initiatives have sort of proposed a baseline and build approach where you have an international baseline and you can add components to it. We really agree with that. We think that's fundamental as a kind of space for collaboration. But that's, for me, I think a really critical aspect of this. The corporate disclosure opportunity shouldn't be missed. It needs to be seized from a collaboration and cooperation point of view.
Sure. Judson?
Yeah, I just want to build on that. I mean, we're obviously a big user of data, including from David's organization. So getting that comparable, consistent, your disclosure data points coming from companies, absolutely critical. And that work by the IFRS, we are huge supporters of. We come from a small country. We try to interact with larger jurisdictions, Europe, US, and so we're always a little bit caught in between. So international standards are something we're always huge supporters of. And I agree with David. It's foreseeable that Europe goes a bit beyond. They've signaled as much as that with their double materiality approach, but I don't think that should get in the way of agreeing on this common baseline. I think there's great power in that. We've seen that with financial accounting standards. We have international IFRS standards that are used by most your countries, and then there's US GAAP, and those two systems can coexist. And they have their differences, but for any global company, we can work with it. I mean, for example, UBS has about 500 other issuers outside of the U.S. actually issue and list securities in the U.S., but we are able to file IFRS standards with the SEC, and those are recognized. You won't have to do full reconciliation to U.S. GAAP. So we think there's a way forward and in a history to build on that. Your two systems like that can coexist, but getting that international standards in place, having companies really start to report on it and provide that foundational data that helps us as investors, as lenders, really understand where companies are on their transitionary path. Absolutely critical. So that IFRS work, I heard it mentioned on the last panel too. I think that would be really a key step forward for 2022 and beyond.
Elon.
Yeah, so certainly on the disclosure front, I completely agree with Judson and David's points. I mean, I suppose the really good news is the US is actually at the table now, because to your original question about when the US and Europe, when that transatlantic relationship works, then we'll see major progress here. I think for a long time the US wasn't at the table, and therefore a fragmented and different speed sort of global approach was really struggling. Whereas now seeing the US, as David says, taking leadership at the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group is great. I think when the US and the European countries, and it's not just an EU, it could be a UK, EU, it could be a Switzerland, when those two sort of major sort of economic groups take leadership on an issue, then we will see progress. And we've seen that the huge progress that has happened in the last year. So the G20 commitments, the agreements at COP, none of this would have been possible without US and European combined commitment and leadership. And in terms of disclosure, well, I suppose I do worry there that it's fantastic progress that the IFRS has made launching this international standards board. It had 41 different jurisdictions all support it at COP26, and that's great. And if it's just as David says, a baseline and build, that would also see major progress. But we'll wait to see what the SEC comes out with some point next year. We know that Europe is pressing on with its own set of rules, and we also know that the UK is itself developing its own sustainable finance roadmap. So I suppose I think that there are plenty of platforms now, plenty of opportunities for both sides of the Atlantic to work together on this. But ultimately, when it comes to implementing rules, will they have that interoperable? Will they enable companies to, as Judson says, financially report using different standards? Will that be able to happen under future ESG sustainability disclosure rules? Well, we'll have to wait and see. But I do think that that those kind of broad global agreements is absolutely critical here. So showing leadership, great, but also having some sort of nod towards interoperability and less fragmentation in the future as well, I think is going to be really key.
So I want to drill down on this a little bit further, and Judson, I'm gonna turn this over to you to be the first one to answer. But it's interesting. I think you've each sort of touched on the IFRS efforts. And the first issue when I joined the chamber 13 years ago, the first issue I actually worked on was global accounting convergence, right? And pre-crisis, pre-financial crisis, there was a lot of momentum towards that happening, and the SEC here was on board under Chris Cox's leadership at the time and all. And while there was a lot of progress made on some individual accounting standards, eventually what happened was that effort sort of cracked up on the shoals of the aftermath of the financial crisis, which, look, we were very supportive of that effort, right? Because if you're a business and you operate globally, and if you're trying to raise capital and you're trying to do that in the global markets, and investors are involved in those global markets, having an international standard makes a lot of sense, right? It allows for flows to happen without friction, but within a scope of certainty. And then when you fast forward, in June of 2019, I participated in a meeting in Stockholm with IOSCO, where there was a lot of discussion about, what are, individual, but also on the international level, what are some of the disclosures that should take place with ESG and also with greenwashing, et cetera. So I think we all agree there's been a lot of discussion around this internationally, but there's not been a lot of collaboration as of yet. How do you think that? I guess it's a two-part question, right? What are some of the platforms that are out there that can help lead to some sort of harmonization of international standards? Because we've got a lot of different platforms out there: TCFD, IFRS, some others. And also, what is it that you've seen that has worked best in the domestic discussions that can maybe be applied globally? So, Judson, if I can maybe turn to you to start the discussion.
Okay, let me try and address each of those parts a little bit, but I'm sure my co-panelists will really fill in lots. Yeah, I think you highlight great points there. There are lots of platforms, probably too many in some cases. So seeing some consolidation is welcomed, and we've actually seen that, with the IFRS effort. Some of the voluntary reporting standards now have folded into the technical secretariat. I have to admit, I was honestly, very pleasantly surprised to see that. It's not often that turkeys vote for Thanksgiving and are willing to give up their place in the landscape. But to their credit, Value Reporting Foundation, the old SASB plus CDSB, willing to do that. So great credit to those organizations to take that forward. And then in terms of driving this convergence, as mentioned before, OSCO, I think will play a critical role, as they did with accounting standards. And you're absolutely right. The idea of the dream of getting single set of global, truly global, used everywhere accounting standards didn't happen yet. But I think we can move forward here, and there are, on climate, I think it will be possible to get very aligned standards, and that can be this initial effort by IFRS, and then build up to other topics. I'm actually part of this task force for nature-related financial disclosure that's hoping to repeat the trick of TCFD in a way on the nature topic. Hopefully that can set a foundation over time. But clearly, Europe will want to go a bit beyond with their double materiality, and I think we have to respect that and expect that, and just find a way to work with it. I mean, what can happen in a domestic setting? I'll just give maybe an example from from Switzerland in terms of how Switzerland's trying to navigate this a little bit at the moment, and particularly when it comes to the actual work by the IFRS. Switzerland is trying to push ahead with TCFD, like many other countries, because we want to get things moving. But they're very deliberately trying to future-proof that a little bit by building in a review clause to their approach that essentially will allow them to bring on board the ISB standards. So once those hopefully come online, so I think there's a way forward there. They are focused just on climate at the moment, also to take that more modular-like approach, so that as other topics come on, maybe nature, social issues, et cetera, as those disclosures get a bit better clear what they should be, how they can be aligned, clearly we'll be able to adopt those as well. So I think there is a way forward here, but it's going to require will on all sides. Honestly, I huge credit to Europe, with the initial expert group, the action plan, and just getting topics moving. I think they took a step well before others were really ready, and I do applaud that. But I think also, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So in that sense, they should feel great about what they've achieved, but also be willing at some level, to let others, take a few steps of their own, and also think about whether there's a way to adapt and a little bit and bring others along with. So I think there is a way forward here, but it's really going to require a lot of political will on all sides.
Elon?
I was going to actually throw in there that similarly to the Swiss approach that Judson outlined, there is potential for the UK also to take a similarly benchmark sort of international approach. In their sustainable finance roadmap, they have highlighted that, or that they've certainly stressed that future standards will be based on the ISSB standards. So they will have disclosure rules, which will effectively be as global rules develop, they will then be folded in. And the UK has also been a big sort of early adopter or follower of the TCFD, and certainly Citi is a big supporter of TCFD. We think that kind of global platform and that kind of framework works really well. And rather than trying to create something that's new and complicated on top of that, actually moving ahead with a TCFD style baseline is probably a good approach. But I actually wanted to twist into a different direction, because we have talked disclosure a lot, and I know we will come back to it because disclosure does dominate a lot of this this topic. But I want to talk about just carbon markets and highlight that in terms of another example of a platform which seems to work is kind of the recent task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets. A good example of lots of global players in this market getting together, tackling a problem, which is that voluntary carbon markets is one of the the key ways that we're going to finance that transition that we're talking about. But it needs integrity, it needs comparability, it needs to be standardized, and so on. And actually, we've got great hopes for that there'll be a positive sort of future outcomes from that, and that will help to scale up those markets. So I think industry, you need a convening power. You need the IAF has shown great leadership there. Mark Carney has certainly been instrumental, but industry coming together and actually agreeing on those kind of standards, and then pushing that forward, I think is another good example of the kind of steps that we need. And hopefully we'll see that the Article 6 agreement at COP will help to provide an underlying framework for those voluntary carbon markets growth, which we really need.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Judson said about political capital in the system, and I would just very gently, of course, push back a little bit on the idea that there hasn't been collaboration. I actually think there's been an unprecedented amount of collaboration and cooperation, and there's also been an unprecedented amount of momentum behind international coordination on sustainable finance. And I think it's about capturing that goodwill and making sure that the architecture I talked about earlier is being activated. So on the policy and regulatory side, we have a fairly sophisticated global architecture for the financial system. We've got the FSB, we've got Basel, we've got IOSCO, things like the OECD exist, the IMF, the World Bank. This architecture is evolving to meet the challenges in sustainability, particularly on the climate challenge. We're seeing the activation of new components in this architecture, like the Network for Greening the Financial System, where the central banks and the supervisors are getting together. That's amazing. We're seeing the G20 Sustainable Finance reactivated and upgraded. That's good to see. That's all collaborative. So we're seeing, new bodies also emerge in this architecture with the ISSB under the IFRS Foundation. That's a huge step, and it's collaborative. So the hardware in the international architecture is largely in place. I think the system needs a software upgrade to capture the climate and ESG conversation we're talking about. It is getting that upgrade. It's slow, and that's why it needs political capital to make the connection that you just outlined at the start between the international and the domestic. If you've got political capital bridging that divide, you can have standards that are comparable across borders and that work across borders. And I think the operating system, in my kind of analogy, is what we need to address to sort of get those systemic risks integrated and then domesticated in that sense. And we have done this before. You mentioned the global financial crisis sort of derailing some of the collaboration on accounting before. We got strong political mandates from the G20 on reform for the financial sector. And in the 10 years that happened after it, the mandates were handed down to the FSB and Basel and IOSCO to design and deploy a new operating system. And that was tested pretty severely in the pandemic that we just had. It worked. So if we've seen the software upgrade work over the last 10 decades, we should build on that for the next 10 years on the climate and sustainability risks. And I think, the good news for me, I think this is happening. The NGFS is steaming ahead. The FSB's delivered its roadmap to the G20. IOSCO's got its 3 work streams completed. The IFRS Foundation is up and running with the ISSB. And, the G20 finance ministers are moving a little bit faster, actually, than the heads of state. And that's positive for me.
And let me just build on that. I think there's a great point here by David. I think there's a lot of muscle memory there that that is being activated. So I think about the last decade, going from Pittsburgh G20 and 4 key concepts on derivatives, recovering resolution planning, the Basel upgrade. I mean, that's actually played out really fairly smoothly over the years. Yes, there are a few differences along the way, but honestly, it was a very well developed design program and very well implemented over time. And to bring that whole infrastructure to bear on this topic, I think it's incredible. And I agree with David, it is starting to happen. It's being supplemented by even new institutions that are a bit sort of R&D factories like the NGFS. And so I think there's a lot of momentum there really to build on. So very, very excited, yeah, for this, where this goes the next few years.
If I could take maybe a slight detour from, let's say, the government side of things, but you all represent and work for important market players here, right? And I was just, as we're discussing this, I was just thinking about this a little bit in terms of, green bonds are first being discussed right at the early part of the last decade, and obviously we've seen great market expansion. We released a study of C-suite members over the summer on climate disclosures, right? And what we actually found, which was interesting, this is large, medium, small companies, 76% were doing some form of climate disclosure, and obviously that was accelerating, right? So this is actually where investors and companies are getting together and figuring that out. What is it that the marketplace can teach policymakers as they're sort of thinking through some of these issues and are trying to put these systems in place? So, Elon, maybe let's start with you on that.
So I suppose partly it's not a fear failure, and so just as not to the perfect be the enemy of the good, as Judson mentioned earlier, because there have been lots of things that have not worked, and just or markets or products or asset classes that the first attempts to turn sustainable has not been the most successful. But then as learning happens, as things move on, we see improvement. So I suppose what I'm trying to articulate is that there doesn't necessarily need to be an enormous grand plan when it comes to the sustainable finance regulatory architecture. But as I think Mark Carney and others have said, any plan beats no plan. So it's really about pushing forward and making clear steps towards it and collaborating over that. I think so. Test and learn, I think is important. I think engagement with stakeholders. I think one of if you look at the history of certainly larger corporates and their own sustainability journey, it's not regulatory driven. It's actually investor driven. It's the big drivers have been investors. They've been employees. It's been consumers. Actually, it's so actually having a process of engagement, of collaboration with, and taking into account views of all of your stakeholders, I think has been very important for the markets. And these things have built on each other. I think getting the infrastructure right has certainly been important. And I talked already about the task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets. I think putting the other parts of the infrastructure in place are important, and then the market will probably build on those. Getting the right incentives. So lots of this, if we think about some of the huge steps forward that have been taken in different markets around the world. So solar panel, the switch towards renewables across Europe, which has really sort of moved forward at dramatic paces. A lot of that was through getting the right incentives in place, wasn't it? It was through feed-in tariffs and contracts for difference and those type of steps, which slowly now been phased out because those forms of energy generation are now profitable on their own, and the cost base has come down so much. However, it needing that initial sharing that risk, putting those incentives in place, which really works. And I think that governments could certainly learn more from those steps. Great. And then policy certainty. Like I say, actually giving, once you've got a clear, once the science is settled and there's a clear consensus, actually legislating for it, putting in place so that market participants know that that's not going to stop, it's not going to be reversed. Like, for example, in Europe and the UK, to that all car manufacturers will have to switch towards electric vehicles, giving a clear signal to investors that funding petrol-driven, gas-driven cars is only has a certain lifeline, and those kind of clear signals I think is really important.
Thank you, David. Judson.
Happy to jump in. I mean, Judson, Ilan, and I think spend most of our lives trying to keep up with the pace of change when it comes to policy and regulation. It's really complicated. It's very complex. And I think one thing that is really important, I think, for the next 10 years to be a success, you know, in that software upgrade I talked about, is remembering that we came up with principles and practices in regulatory frameworks in order to achieve certain outcomes that we have learned from in the past. And when we're crossing this threshold into the ESG and climate space, which is new, it's a bit of a wilderness right now, and there aren't familiar milestones. There are familiar milestones behind us that we need to keep in mind, and actually some of them we need to start moving, towards that frontier. So we really believe that those policy initiatives can benefit from hindsight, but also should be pursued on the basis of coordination and harmonization rather than market fragmentation. That's going to make everyone's life more difficult if we have incompatible regulatory requirements. We're starting to see a bit of that. But I think the private sector can play an important role in facilitating the dialogue. There really needs to be a public-private sector dialogue to ensure that the standards that we're building are compatible and to avoid that fragmentation. We at S&P Global have tried to be as consistent as possible globally with our positions, and it's difficult to be consistent everywhere because there are different contexts and narratives. But we really do try to say the same thing in Washington and in Brussels because we think that we should be setting an example in that space. To be really frank about this, the EU is ahead. The EU taxonomy, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU are all going to set global benchmarks in this space, global standards, and they will find you, and you'll have to deal with them probably if you're interacting with financial markets or supply chains. They're not perfect. They're the first big step on this new planet. And they're going to have a profound effect around the world through supply chains. Just think of GDPR. This is kind of the GDPR of the finance world. And it's becoming complex. It's becoming very difficult to keep to timelines. And I think I agree with what Judson said. Pride of ownership here, or thinking that you've solved it and the only way is the way you have solved it is a bad approach. It needs to be iterative. You need to learn by doing, but then admit that maybe it can be done better.
And offer two or maybe just three quick points.
Yeah.
I mean, one, and what the markets can offer is you're not to fear the innovation. When I think about the first sustainability-linked transaction came out, I think it was the Enel transaction. A lot of investors were skeptical of that. What is that? How does that work? Why do you have a step up or a step down? You're based on KPIs. But that's actually become a very popular structure and then being used now for social issues even. I think that it shows that we need innovation. We need innovation in financial instruments. We need innovation, obviously, in the real economy. The second bit would be not to forget that essentially we have very highly aligned interests here. The policymakers, the financial sector, the real economy, societies. We're all trying to row in the same direction. So there doesn't need to be the same level of and sometimes skepticism of what the finance sector is doing. I think that was certainly a bit well deserved in the 2010s, and we needed to go through that process. But here, I think they're highly aligned interests. And then, final point to build on David's is there can be different approaches taken. I have to kind of think about these taxonomies. And one way is clearly to try and measure greenness upwards, but another way is to try and measure carbon down to zero with these alignment measures. And I think those two tools, they're just measuring tools. They're trying to essentially get to the same end, which is decarbonize set of production activities in a net zero economy. So I think those two things can be recognized as essentially two roads to Rome, or I guess two roads to Paris, really, but essentially equivalent tools. So we can have multiple measuring tools that are helping us achieve the same objectives.
So I've gotten a note. We've got 2 minutes left. So I'm just going to do one question, but do a lightning round of answers here. And Ilan, if we could start with you, and then just ask David and Judson to answer as well. So if you were here and you were talking to a room full of global financial regulators, what's the one thing you would ask them to do to get to success?
Cooperate.
Okay. David.
That's a difficult act to follow. I would say
Sorry.
I would expand it to, if I have the permission to expand it to all policymakers, and I would say financial markets can do a lot, to Ilan's point, but they can't do everything. So I'd ask them to focus more on implementing policies that will actually help price sustainability risks rather than just classify them or disclose them. If we really want to see momentum here on the targets that they have set in the policy space, we actually need to see concrete steps taken to deliver the transition in concrete terms, price the externalities, and support the companies that need to make the transition. That would be my longer than Ilan's response.
International standards, or at least interoperability, open dialogue, and open minds.
All right, we'll leave it at that. So, Ilan, David, Judson, I want to thank you for this conversation. I feel like we just scratched the surface. I think we could have gone on for much, much longer because there's just so much going on here. But that's the point. There is a lot going on here, both in terms of market developments, but also in terms of policy discussions, both domestically and globally. So I know from our vantage point at the Chamber, this is something that we are working on very extensively in partnership with the International Division. In fact, we were having a discussion earlier this morning about what we should be doing next year in terms of some of our international meetings on some of this. I want to thank each of you for joining us in a set of policy developments that are extremely important on some of the most important issues that our members are facing and trying to get this into the right place. So with that, I would like to turn it over to my colleague and partner on these issues, Marjorie, with the International Division. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, to you and your panelists, and indeed, thanks to all our guests throughout this first day of this year's Transatlantic Business Works Summit. What a great kickoff today. We heard about important moves by policymakers to strengthen transatlantic ties, including through successful efforts to address some high-profile, long-standing bilateral trade irritants, as well as through the establishment of the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. We also heard from speakers about countless opportunities for the US and EU to collaborate, particularly with respect to the digital and green transitions. On the digital front, the US and Europe are leading the way in developing cutting-edge technologies that shape our societies and our economies, technologies like AI and quantum computing and autonomous vehicles. We also have the ability, indeed the obligation, to jointly write the rules of the road for our rapidly digitalizing global economy, especially when faced with common challenges from others who don't share our free market democratic principles. We also have to be vigilant about diverging approaches to digital regulation. You heard earlier from some panelists who flagged the concerns they have about the risks of transatlantic tech decoupling. That's something we want to avoid at all costs. On climate and sustainability, the US and Europe, the government, the private sector, civil society, all have a deep commitment to working together to foster a healthy green transition. Many of the technologies we need to meet our ambitious climate goals don't yet exist. But we have the capacity to develop those solutions, and our success depends on a regulatory environment that encourages innovation and collaboration. While their topics were different, all of our speakers pointed to two essential ingredients for transatlantic success. First, the importance of partnership, and second, the imperative of leadership. We'll pick up on these same themes tomorrow during day 2 of the Transatlantic Business Works Summit. We'll be joined tomorrow by Ambassador Catherine Tai and by European Commission Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager, as well as by panelists who will talk about the collaboration on supply chain security, lessons learned from the pandemic, as well as how the US and EU can partner to jointly address shared challenges from non-market economies. Tomorrow's program will be streamed using the same link that we shared with you today, and we'll send an email reminder to that effect. In closing, let me thank my terrific team here at the Chamber, all of our compatriots across the organization, as well as to our sponsors, Amazon, Bayer, Citi, Google, Microsoft, and UPS, whose support make today's event possible. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We'll We'll see you tomorrow.